Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we plunge headfirst into a topic as captivating as it is, well, uncomfortable. The intricate, often perplexing and sometimes genuinely unsettling sexual practices of the Tudor era. It's a period brimming with dramatic shifts in power, religion and social custom, and through it all the most intimate aspects of human life were constantly under scrutiny, manipulated and legislated. So, if you're picturing velvet gowns and chivalrous knights, think again. The realities were far grittier, far more desperate, and frankly, some of the characters we'll meet probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now tell me, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it there? Post it in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The very air of the Tudor court, particularly as the 16th century unfolds, seems thick with a palpable tension surrounding succession. Every cough, every ache, every whisper of a queen's morning sickness becomes a matter of national security, a ripple in the fabric of England's destiny. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, ascends to the throne after the bloody Wars of the Roses, his claim solidified by his marriage to Elizabeth of York. Their union isn't just a love match, it's a strategic merger, a healing balm for a divided nation. Yet, even with this calculated beginning, the pressure for male heirs begins to mount almost immediately. Their firstborn, Arthur, Prince of Wales, is the beacon of hope, a living testament to the newfound stability. Everyone breathes a collective sigh of relief, or so it seems. Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the formidable Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, is another meticulously planned dynastic coup. She arrives in England, a young woman steeped in the rigid etiquette of the Spanish court, ready to fulfil her duty. The future of England, it appears, hinges on their consummation, on the production of more healthy princes to secure the Tudor line. The marriage itself, a lavish affair, is a public declaration of an alliance, a display of wealth and power. But then tragedy strikes. Arthur, barely into his teens, succumbs to the sweating sickness, a mysterious and terrifying malady that sweeps through England with brutal efficiency. The collective gasp is almost audible, a chilling premonition of the succession crisis that will plague the dynasty for decades. With Arthur gone, the carefully constructed edifice of Tudor succession begins to wobble. All eyes turn to Henry, Arthur's younger brother, now the heir apparent. And, perhaps more crucially, to Catherine. The question of her marriage to Henry becomes an ecclesiastical and political minefield. To marry his brother's widow, Henry needs a papal dispensation. Catherine, ever steadfast, insists her marriage to Arthur was never consummated. This single point becomes the linchpin of an argument that will reverberate through history, leading to England's break from Rome and the tumultuous birth of the Church of England. Historians still argue whether Catherine's claim of non-consummation was a genuine reflection of intimacy or a strategic declaration to secure her future in England. The truth, like so much else from this era, remains shrouded in the mists of time, a delicious puzzle for scholars to untangle. The very concept of a king's bedroom in the Tudor era is not a private sanctuary, as we might conceive it today. It's a stage, a political arena where alliances are forged or shattered, where the future of a nation is quite literally conceived. The act of sex itself, particularly within royal marriage, transcends mere personal gratification. It is a duty, a solemn obligation to the realm. When a queen becomes pregnant, the joy is not merely personal, it is a national celebration, often marked by public prayers and thanksgiving. Conversely, miscarriages or stillbirths plunge the court into a palpable gloom, a quiet despair that speaks volumes about the fragility of power and the ever-present shadow of uncertainty. One can almost hear the anxious murmurs behind closed doors, the hushed conversations about the Queen's health, the fervent prayers for a son. Consider the expectations placed upon royal consorts. They are first and foremost baby-making machines, their bodies perceived as vessels for the continuation of the lineage. This expectation isn't unique to the Tudors, of course, but it reaches a fever pitch under Henry VIII, whose relentless pursuit of a male heir ultimately reshapes the religious landscape of England. His desperate need for a son who could rule, who could secure the dynasty, drives his notorious marital merry-go-round. He divorces Catherine, executes Anne Boleyn, loses Jane Seymour to childbirth, divorces Anne of Cleves, executes Catherine Howard and outlives Catherine Parr. Each marital upheaval is a direct consequence of this singular, overwhelming dynastic pressure. It's enough to make one wonder if anyone actually enjoyed their honeymoon. Perhaps it felt more like a job interview with very high and frankly very bloody stakes. The sexual act itself within marriage is seen as divinely sanctioned for procreation. Any other purpose, especially anything deemed unnatural or non-procreative, risks condemnation. This theological underpinning shapes the social fabric, influencing everything from daily interactions to legal statutes. The Church, despite its eventual schism, maintains a strong grip on moral conduct, and sexual transgressions are not just personal failings, but sins against God and society. Confessionals are busy places, one can imagine, filled with whispered tales of lust and transgression. This era also grapples with the understanding of conception. The prevailing belief, largely derived from ancient Greek and Roman medical texts, is that both male and female seed are required for conception. The female seed, or humor, is thought to contribute to the formation of the child, but the male seed is considered the primary active ingredient, the true source of life. This patriarchal view subtly reinforces the importance of the male line and the perceived dominance of men in the act of procreation. It's a bit like imagining a cosmic bake-off, where the man brings the main ingredient, and the woman merely provides the oven and a few sprinkles. The king's need for an heir isn't merely about continuing his name, it's about stability, about preventing another brutal civil war like the one that brought his father to power. A clear line of succession discourages ambitious nobles from plotting, reduces the likelihood of rival claims to the throne, and ensures a peaceful transition of power. Without it, the fear of chaos, of a return to the bad old days of endless conflict, is ever present. This fear, this almost primal need for order, casts a long shadow over the most intimate moments of royal life. It dictates alliances, drives foreign policy, and ultimately condemns two of Henry VIII's wives to the block. The axe, in a perverse way, becomes an extension of dynastic ambition. The common people too are bound by similar pressures, albeit without the gilded cages and political machinations of the court. For them, children mean labour, security in old age, and the continuation of the family name and livelihood. While they might not face the threat of execution for failing to produce a male heir, barrenness or a lack of sons could bring its own set of anxieties, leading to whispers of divine displeasure or even witchcraft. It's a world where every pregnancy, every birth, is a mini-drama, a hopeful gamble against the high odds of infant mortality. The Tudor period truly is a study in how deeply intertwined the personal and the political, the intimate and the public, truly are. The royal bedchamber, far from being a private space, becomes a microcosm of the entire kingdom, reflecting its anxieties, its ambitions, and its brutal realities. The journey from betrothal to consummation in Tudor England was rarely a swift romantic dash to the altar. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated process, often drawn out and punctuated by legal and religious formalities. A betrothal, or spousals de futuro, was a solemn promise to marry at a later date, and in the eyes of the Church it carried significant weight, almost as binding as marriage itself, particularly if followed by physical intimacy. Imagine the anxious parents poring over legal documents, negotiating dowries and jointures, all while their children, often still in their tender years, are paraded before each other, their futures meticulously planned out before they even understand the full implications. This wasn't about love in the modern sense, it was about alliance, property and lineage. For the nobility and royalty, these agreements could span years, sometimes decades, as the intended bride and groom matured. Catherine of Aragon, for example, was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, when she was barely 3 years old. While such an early betrothal obviously precluded immediate consummation, it legally bound the parties, making it difficult, though not impossible, to back out. The Church, ever keen on maintaining order and upholding its own authority, considered a broken betrothal a serious matter, often requiring papal dispensation or a lengthy legal process to dissolve. It's a bit like putting down a non-refundable deposit on a very, very long-term commitment, only the commitment involves your entire life and the future of your family line. The true legal and spiritual union, however, hinged on the spousal de presenti, a declaration of present intent to marry typically exchanged at the church door, followed by the actual wedding ceremony. Yet, even after this, the marriage was not considered fully complete, fully indissoluble, until it had been consummated. The act of consummation, the physical union of husband and wife, transformed a contractual agreement into an unbreakable bond in the eyes of both canon law and much of society. This emphasis on consummation is a mainstream historical fact that profoundly shaped marital disputes and annulment cases throughout the era, most notably in the tumultuous saga of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. The first night, the wedding night, therefore, was not merely a private celebration. It often held a public, almost performative dimension, particularly for the elite. The bedding ceremony, though not always universally practiced or equally elaborate, was a peculiar tradition where the newly married couple would be escorted to their bedchamber by family, friends, and even servants. They would be undressed, often with much joviality and ribald jokes, and then tucked into bed, sometimes with a symbolic drink or a final blessing. This public witnessing, or at least the knowledge of it, served as a communal acknowledgement that the marriage was officially physically commencing. It was a societal confirmation, leaving little room for doubt about the union's validity. Imagine the awkward silence, or perhaps the forced laughter, as a young couple, perhaps barely acquainted, are shooed into their marital bed while their entire extended family stands by, offering unsolicited advice and a hearty round of applause. It's enough to make even the most outgoing introvert yearn for a silent disco and a strong cup of chamomile. For the upper classes especially, there was an intense pressure to produce heirs swiftly. Barrenness, or a lack of male offspring, could lead to immense social anxiety, whispers of divine displeasure, and, in royal circles, political instability. The consummation of the marriage was therefore not just a religious or legal necessity, but a practical one, the first step in fulfilling the paramount duty of procreation. The pressure on the bride, in particular, must have been immense, carrying the weight of her family's future, and, for queens, the nation's. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit: the belief in the importance of the bride's virginity. While highly valued across all social strata for women, it held an almost mystical significance in securing alliances, particularly for royal or noble families. A bride's untarnished purity was a symbol of her family's honour and a guarantee of the legitimacy of any future offspring. There were even practices, now thankfully obsolete, of publicly displaying the proof of consummation, often by exhibiting the bloodied sheets the morning after the wedding. This gruesome yet strangely accepted custom aimed to remove any doubt about the bride's virginity and the subsequent legitimacy of the marriage. One shudders to think of the poor chambermaids tasked with this rather delicate display. It makes modern-day wedding photos seem positively tame by comparison. The concept of carnal knowledge was central to legal annulments. If a marriage could be proven never to have been consummated, it could be annulled, effectively declared null and void from the beginning, as if it never happened. This was a critical distinction from divorce, which in the Tudor era was almost impossible to obtain, as it implied ending a valid marriage. Annulment, on the other hand, stated that no true marriage had ever existed. This legal loophole, narrow as it was, became the battleground for Henry VIII's relentless pursuit of an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. His argument rested on the biblical prohibition against marrying one's brother's widow, which he argued was an impediment to a true marriage, even with papal dispensation, and therefore their union had never been truly consummated in the eyes of God. He needed to prove to a sceptical world that he and Catherine had never truly been one flesh. Historians still argue whether Henry VIII genuinely believed his marriage to Catherine was unholy, or if his religious scruples conveniently aligned with his desire for a male heir and Anne Boleyn. Was it true faith, or was it a masterful political manoeuvre cloaked in theological justification? The debate highlights the complex interplay of personal desire, religious doctrine, and political ambition that defined the era. The very act of intimate union, traditionally seen as sacred, was weaponized in the highest courts of the land. For the common folk, while the legalities were less grand, the underlying principles remained. Betrothal often involved the exchange of vows or tokens, sometimes in public, witnessed by friends or family, making it difficult to renege. The social pressure to marry and procreate was immense. Children were an economic necessity, providing labour for farms and workshops and care for ageing parents. A couple who failed to produce offspring might face social stigma, pity, or even accusations of witchcraft, particularly if the lack of children was attributed to a woman. The village gossip, one can imagine, would be rife with theories and conjectures, proving that human nature, for all its complexities, rarely changes. The whispers in the market square could be just as potent, if not more so, than the decrees from a royal court. The concept of consent, too, was far more nuanced than in modern times. While forced marriages were legally condemned, social and economic pressures often dictated choices. A young woman might have little say in her betrothal, her future mapped out by her parents based on practical considerations rather than her emotional inclination. Once betrothed, and especially after the wedding ceremony, withdrawing consent was almost unheard of, and attempting to do so carried significant social and legal penalties. It was a world where individual desire often took a backseat to familial duty and societal expectation, a stark contrast to our modern notions of romantic love as the foundation of marriage. The physical act itself, while essential for procreation, was not always openly discussed, at least not in polite company. Despite the public bedding ceremonies, there was a certain decorum expected. The specifics of intimate relations were often passed down discreetly, through advice from mothers to daughters, or hushed conversations among married women. Yet behind closed doors, a more pragmatic approach surely prevailed, driven by the biological imperative to continue the family line. The Tudor period, therefore, presents a fascinating paradox. On one hand, there is an intense focus on the legitimacy of unions and the production of heirs, almost to the point of public performance. On the other hand, the intimate details of how those heirs were conceived remain shrouded in a veil of polite silence and unspoken understanding. The consummation of marriage was the hinge upon which many fates turned, a legal and religious cornerstone that, when challenged, could bring down empires, or at the very least, reshape the religious and political landscape for generations to come. It's a testament to how profoundly a single, intimate act could reverberate throughout history, leaving us to ponder its implications centuries later. The shadow of illegitimacy loomed large over Tudor society, a constant chilling reminder of the rigid moral codes and legal frameworks that governed sexual conduct. To be born outside the bonds of wedlock was to enter a world fraught with disadvantages, a life often marked by social stigma, economic hardship, and legal vulnerability. It wasn't merely a matter of social disapproval. The law itself enshrined the distinctions between the legitimate and the illegitimate, creating a tangible, often insurmountable barrier to social mobility and inheritance. A child born to unmarried parents was legally considered filius nullius, a child of nobody. This stark legal designation stripped them of many of the rights afforded to those born within marriage. They had no legal claim to their father's name or property, and their mother's legal connection, while undeniable in fact, was often insufficient to grant them the full rights of inheritance or social standing that legitimate children enjoyed. Imagine a tiny human, innocent of any wrongdoing, carrying the burden of their parents' perceived transgression from the moment of their birth. It's a harsh reality that highlights the era's unforgiving social structures. The societal condemnation of illegitimacy stemmed from a powerful combination of religious doctrine and practical considerations. The Church vehemently condemned sexual relations outside of marriage as sinful, viewing them as a transgression against divine law. This religious disapproval translated directly into social opprobrium. A woman who bore an illegitimate child faced severe moral judgment, often ostracized by her community, her reputation irrevocably stained. For men, the consequences were often less severe, reflecting the patriarchal biases of the time, though they could be compelled to financially support the child, particularly if the mother appealed to the local authorities. Economically, illegitimate children were often in a precarious position. Without a legal father, they lacked the traditional means of support and could not inherit land or titles. This meant a life of likely poverty, often forced into labour at a young age or relying on parish charity. The parish poor rates, in fact, often bore the burden of supporting these children, which led to local authorities becoming quite proactive in identifying and compelling fathers to contribute, if only to alleviate the financial strain on the community. It's a crude form of social welfare, driven more by practical cost-saving than by altruism. A peculiar, yet significant aspect of Tudor law regarding illegitimacy concerned the concept of bastardy bonds. These were legal agreements, often initiated by parish officials, compelling the presumed father of an illegitimate child to provide financial support, typically a weekly sum, to the mother or the parish. If the father refused, he could be imprisoned. This mainstream historical fact demonstrates the proactive measures taken by local authorities to ensure that illegitimate children did not become a drain on public resources. It was a pragmatic response to a social problem, albeit one that placed considerable pressure on both parents, and certainly not the kind of romantic gesture one imagines accompanying the arrival of a new baby. The social stigma extended beyond the immediate family. The stain of illegitimacy could affect future generations, making it harder for illegitimate children to marry into respectable families or achieve social advancement. Their very existence was a public reminder of a moral failing, a breach of accepted norms that society was keen to punish and deter. One can almost hear the whispered gossip in the village square, the pointed fingers, the sidelong glances that followed those born on the wrong side of the blanket. However, there were rare, albeit significant exceptions, particularly in the upper echelons of society. Royal bastards, though legally barred from inheriting the throne, sometimes held considerable power and influence, especially if acknowledged by their royal father. Henry VIII himself famously acknowledged Henry Fitzroy, his son by Elizabeth Blount. Fitzroy was showered with titles, wealth, and a prestigious education, for a time even being considered a potential heir if Henry VIII could not secure a legitimate male successor. This quirky tidbit illustrates that while the legal framework of illegitimacy was rigid, the practical application could be bent, particularly when political expediency or a king's personal affections came into play. It's a sharp contrast to the unforgiving reality faced by the vast majority of illegitimate children. Despite the harsh realities, historians still argue whether the social and economic conditions for illegitimate children in Tudor England were universally dreadful, or varied significantly depending on local circumstances and the child's individual abilities. While the legal framework was clear, the reality on the ground might have seen some illegitimate children integrated into communities, especially if their mothers were able to secure some form of support, or if they possessed particular skills that made them valuable. However, these would certainly have been the exceptions rather than the rule, and their path would undoubtedly have been harder than that of their legitimate counterparts. The very language used to describe illegitimate children reflects the societal disdain. Bastard, whoreson, love child. Though this term often carried a more romantic, less condemning connotation later on, in Tudor times it still marked the child as outside the norm. These labels were not just descriptive, they were often derogatory, carrying a heavy weight of judgment. The psychological toll on individuals carrying such a label must have been immense, a constant reminder of their marginalised status. The Church's role in prosecuting sexual offences, including fornication leading to illegitimate births, was significant. Ecclesiastical courts heard cases of moral transgressions, imposing penances that could range from public humiliation, such as standing in a white sheet during church services, a truly mortifying experience, to fines or even imprisonment in extreme cases. These punishments were designed not only to chastise the individuals involved, but also to serve as a public deterrent, reinforcing moral norms within the community. Imagine having to endure the stares and whispers of your entire congregation, all while clad in a stark white sheet, a living embodiment of public shame. It's a form of social engineering designed to keep everyone in line. The consequences for mothers of illegitimate children were particularly severe. They often lost their reputation, making it difficult to find work or marry. Some might be driven to infanticide in desperation, a tragic outcome that, while punishable by death, tragically reflects the immense pressures and lack of support faced by women in such circumstances. The very act of childbirth, typically a moment of joy, could become a moment of profound despair, marking the beginning of a life of struggle for both mother and child. Even for those who managed to escape extreme poverty, the stigma often lingered. An illegitimate child, no matter how successful, might always find doors closed to them that were open to others. Social advancement was an uphill battle, requiring exceptional talent, luck, or the patronage of a powerful individual. The bar sinister, in heraldry, a diagonal line across a coat of arms, historically denoted illegitimacy, a permanent visual reminder of a family's irregular lineage, further emphasising the public nature of this social distinction. In essence, illegitimacy in Tudor England wasn't just a deviation from a norm, it was a fundamental breach of the social order. a challenge to the established structures of family, property and power. The consequences, both legal and social, were designed to reinforce the sanctity of marriage and to regulate sexual behaviour within its confines. While the tales of royal bastards might offer a glimmer of nuance, the overwhelming reality for most was a life defined by disadvantage, a constant struggle against a society determined to remind them of their origins. It's a stark reminder that in an era obsessed with lineage and legitimate succession, the unacknowledged child truly was a child of nobody, adrift in a sea of judgment. The concept of incest, as understood and legislated in Tudor England, was deeply rooted in biblical prescriptions and centuries of canon law, delineating rigid boundaries around marital and sexual relations within kinship. These prohibited degrees of kinship were not merely social taboos, they were legal impediments to marriage, rendering unions within these bounds null and void in the eyes of the Church, and by extension, the state. To transgress these lines was to commit a grave sin, a moral and social affront that could have devastating consequences, both personal and political. The Old Testament, particularly the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, served as the primary scriptural foundation for these prohibitions. These texts explicitly listed certain relationships, parent and child, siblings, aunts, uncles and nieces, nephews, and in-laws, affinity, as forbidden for sexual or marital union. The underlying principle was often one of preventing moral corruption, maintaining social order, and ensuring the purity of family lines. It's worth noting that the interpretation of these biblical verses, particularly concerning relationships by affinity, kinship through marriage, became a crucial point of contention and a tool in the hands of those seeking to manipulate marital law. For instance, the marriage of a man to his deceased brother's widow was a particularly complex issue, as we've already touched upon with Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Leviticus chapter 18 and chapter 20 seem to explicitly forbid such a union, stating, "Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. It is thy brother's nakedness." However, Deuteronomy chapter 25 offered a seemingly contradictory instruction, known as the Levirate law, which commanded a man to marry his deceased childless brother's widow to raise up seed to his brother. This apparent contradiction provided fertile ground for theological debate and political manoeuvring. Henry VIII seized upon the Levitical prohibition, arguing that his marriage to Catherine, his brother Arthur's widow, was incestuous in the eyes of God, and therefore cursed with male barrenness. This mainstream historical fact became the theological fulcrum of the English Reformation. The ecclesiastical courts, rather than civil courts, held primary jurisdiction over matters of marriage and sexual morality, including incest. Individuals found to have entered into or engaged in relations within the prohibited degrees faced severe spiritual penances, public humiliation, and potential excommunication. The very act of living in what was deemed an incestuous union was a persistent scandal, challenging the moral fabric of the community. Imagine the pressure to conform, to avoid any hint of such a transgression, knowing that the Church, with its pervasive influence, was watching. The definition of kinship for the purposes of these prohibitions extended beyond blood relatives, consanguinity, to include relatives by marriage, affinity. This meant that if you married someone, their blood relatives became your relatives by affinity, and you were thus prohibited from marrying certain members of their family, even if there was no biological connection. This concept could be quite intricate and, as Henry VIII demonstrated, open to interpretation and legal challenges. It's a bit like a medieval social network where every connection, even through marriage, comes with a new set of rules and prohibitions, creating a tangled web of potential pitfalls. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era relates to the popular belief in spiritual kinship, which also created impediments to marriage. This arose from the practice of godparenthood, because godparents and their godchildren were considered to have a spiritual bond akin to blood relations. Marriage between a godparent and their godchild, or even between god-siblings, was officially prohibited by the Church. While this may seem arcane to modern sensibilities, it reflected a deep belief in the sacred nature of spiritual relationships and their capacity to create genuine, albeit non-biological, bonds of kinship. It's a testament to the Church's pervasive influence, extending its regulatory reach even into the realm of spiritual patronage. Historians still argue whether the strict enforcement of incest prohibitions was primarily driven by genuine religious conviction, or by practical concerns about property inheritance and preventing too much concentration of wealth within a few interconnected families. While religious doctrine certainly provided the moral and legal framework, the socio-economic implications of incestuous unions, particularly in noble families where intermarriage could consolidate vast fortunes, cannot be ignored. The debate highlights the complex interplay between piety and pragmatism that often characterised Tudor society. The fear of divine wrath was a powerful deterrent against incest. Illness, misfortune, or a lack of male heirs might be interpreted as God's punishment for an illicit union. This fear was not merely superstitious, it was deeply ingrained in the worldview of the time. When Henry VIII faced the reality of only having a daughter, Mary, with Catherine, he readily embraced the idea that his marriage was cursed due to its supposed incestuous nature, seeing it as a clear sign of divine displeasure. This narrative provided a convenient justification for his desire for an annulment and a new wife. For the common people, violations of incest laws, though perhaps less politically charged, still carried immense social shame and legal consequences. Accusations could be brought before the ecclesiastical courts by concerned neighbours or parish officials. Public penance, often including wearing a white sheet and standing before the congregation, would be enforced, a deeply humiliating punishment designed to cleanse the individual and restore communal order. The whispers and judgmental stares from one's community would be a powerful, persistent form of social control. Instances of clear, undeniable incest, such as between a parent and child or full siblings, were universally condemned and often led to ostracism or even more severe legal repercussions if they came to light. While records of such extreme cases might be sparse due to the intense stigma and efforts to conceal them, the very extremity of the prohibition underscores its importance in maintaining social order and the sanctity of the family unit. The horror associated with such acts would have been visceral and deeply ingrained. Dispensation from these prohibitions, particularly for marriages within the degrees of affinity, could sometimes be granted by the Pope, usually for significant political or financial considerations. This was precisely what Catherine of Aragon relied upon. Pope Julius II had granted a dispensation for her marriage to Henry VIII. When Henry sought his annulment, he argued that the Pope had no authority to override a divine prohibition, rendering the dispensation invalid. This argument challenged not only the legitimacy of his marriage, but also the very authority of the papacy, leading directly to the monumental shift of the Reformation. It's a striking example of how a seemingly arcane point of canon law could ignite a revolution. The ongoing debates about the precise interpretation of these degrees of kinship, particularly concerning affinity, highlight the fluidity and manipulability of legal and religious texts in the hands of powerful figures. What was deemed incestuous one day could, with enough theological cleverness and political pressure, be reinterpreted the next. It reveals a society grappling with complex moral questions, often with earthly consequences hanging in the balance. In essence, the Tudor era's understanding of incest was not just about biological closeness. It was a complex web of religious law, social custom, and political expediency. The prohibited degrees were formidable barriers, designed to regulate marriage, maintain social order, and perhaps most crucially, to ensure the perceived legitimacy and divine sanction of unions, particularly those that held the fate of the realm in their hands. The shadow of incest, whether real or conveniently imagined, proved to be a powerful force that reshaped the destiny of a nation. Despite the stringent moral pronouncements of the Church and the severe legal penalties for sexual transgression, prostitution in Tudor England was an undeniable, if often clandestine, reality. It thrived in the shadows of society, a necessary evil tolerated by some, condemned by many, and ultimately woven into the fabric of urban life. While official rhetoric castigated harlots and bawds as morally corrupt, the practical demand for their services ensured a resilient if precarious existence for those involved. The most famous or infamous district associated with prostitution was the Stews in Suffolk, just across the River Thames from the City of London. For centuries this area operated as a designated red light district, albeit under varying degrees of official sanction and regulation. The Bishop of Winchester surprisingly owned many of these brothels, and the women who worked in them were, somewhat ironically known as Winchester geese. This mainstream historical fact highlights the perplexing duality of the era. Powerful ecclesiastical figures, ostensibly upholders of moral rectitude, were also direct beneficiaries of activities they officially condemned. It's a classic example of walking a very thin line between piety and profit, with a knowing wink and a nod. These stews were not entirely unregulated. There were attempts, albeit often futile, to control them. Laws dictated closing times, prohibited the admission of married men, and forbade women from working on Sundays or holy days. However, enforcement was often lax, and the pursuit of profit frequently trumped moral rectitude. The women themselves were often subject to arbitrary rules and exploitation, caught between the demands of their clients, the greed of the brothel keepers, boards, and the ever-present threat of legal reprisal. Their lives were undoubtedly harsh, often short, and rarely afforded dignity. Beyond the formal stews, prostitution permeated other aspects of urban life. Taverns, alehouses, and bathhouses, often euphemistically called bagnios, frequently served as fronts for sexual encounters. These establishments offered a discreet, or sometimes not so discreet environment for illicit liaisons. The bustling streets of London, with their throngs of merchants, apprentices and labourers, provided ample opportunity for streetwalkers. One can imagine the furtive glances, the hushed negotiations, the quick transactions in dimly lit alleyways. It's a testament to human ingenuity, or perhaps desperation, that such a thriving underground economy could flourish amidst such a strict moral climate. The lives of prostitutes were deeply precarious. They were largely unprotected by law, vulnerable to violence, disease and exploitation. While theoretically protected by certain regulations in practice, they often faced arrest, public shaming and imprisonment. Punishments could include being whipped, placed in the stocks, or even banished from the city. The stigma attached to their profession was immense, often condemning them to a life on the margins, with little hope of returning to respectable society. Their very existence was a constant reminder of the era's hypocrisy and its stark class divisions. For the boards, the keepers of the brothels, the trade could be lucrative but also dangerous. They too faced legal penalties if caught operating outside sanctioned areas or violating regulations. Yet many managed to amass considerable wealth, often through a combination of cunning, corruption, and a keen understanding of human desire. They were the entrepreneurs of the underworld, navigating a complex web of official disapproval and unofficial tolerance. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to prostitution in Tudor times is the use of distinct clothing or markings to identify prostitutes, particularly in the stews. While not universally enforced, there were attempts to make women working in these areas wear specific types of garments, such as striped hoods or cloaks, or even to shave their heads. The idea was to visually distinguish them from respectable women, allowing clients to easily identify them while simultaneously subjecting them to public shame and control. Imagine strolling through Southwark and seeing women conspicuously marked, a living, breathing scarlet letter on the very streets. It's a crude form of social engineering, designed to compartmentalize and contain perceived moral threats. Historians still argue whether the official tolerance of the Southwark stews was a pragmatic recognition of an unavoidable vice, a cynical revenue-generating scheme, or a deliberate attempt to confine and manage prostitution in a specific area, thereby protecting the purity of the rest of the city. Perhaps it was a complex combination of all these factors, reflecting the nuanced and often contradictory attitudes towards sexuality in Tudor society. The debate illuminates the challenge of interpreting historical actions through a purely modern moral lens. The clientele of prostitutes was diverse, ranging from wealthy merchants and noblemen to apprentices and common labourers. For some, it might have been a means to satisfy desires outside the confines of marriage, or a release from the rigid social strictures of the time. For others, it might have been their only access to sexual intimacy, particularly for those whose social status or economic means precluded marriage. It highlights the vast disparities in sexual agency and opportunity that existed within Tudor society. Disease, particularly syphilis, which we will delve into further in the next section, was an ever-present and devastating risk for prostitutes. Without effective treatments, the spread of sexually transmitted infections would have been rampant, contributing to their shortened lifespans and further physical suffering. The dangers were immense, yet the economic desperation of many women, particularly those from impoverished backgrounds, often left them with few other options for survival. The moral condemnation of prostitution was constantly articulated by religious leaders and moralists. Sermons railed against the sins of the flesh, and pamphlets warned of the dangers of lust. Yet the persistence of prostitution suggests that these condemnations, while powerful, could not entirely suppress human desires or the economic forces that drove women into the trade. It's a testament to the enduring gap between stated ideals and lived realities. The gap between pious pronouncements and practical necessities was, in many ways, the unacknowledged theme of the entire Tudor era. Royal figures, despite their public moralising, were not immune to the temptations of illicit liaisons. While detailed accounts of royal visits to brothels are rare, the existence of royal mistresses and illegitimate children suggests that a certain degree of sexual license was tolerated, particularly for men, provided it remained discreet and did not openly challenge the established order of succession. The standards, it seems, were often different for those at the very top of the social hierarchy. The suppression of the stews in Suffolk, a significant event in 1546 under Henry VIII, marked a shift, at least officially, in the Crown's attitude towards organised prostitution. While the actual impact of this suppression on the prevalence of prostitution is debated, it likely simply pushed it further underground rather than eradicating it. It signalled a more overt condemnation from the state. Perhaps it was a gesture towards moral reform, or perhaps another example of state control over all aspects of society, even its vices. Either way, it highlighted the evolving and often inconsistent ways in which authorities attempted to manage sexual practices outside the confines of marriage. In essence, prostitution in Tudor England existed in a complex, contradictory space, simultaneously condemned and tacitly tolerated. It was a reflection of the era's moral hypocrisy, its stark social inequalities, and the enduring power of human desire. The Winchester geese and their sisters of the street offer a grim yet compelling glimpse into the lives of those who existed on the fringes of acceptable society. Their stories often untold, their struggles largely unacknowledged, yet their presence an undeniable feature of the Tudor landscape. The arrival of syphilis in Europe in the late 15th century, dubbed the Great Pox to distinguish it from smallpox, sent shockwaves through society, profoundly impacting sexual practices, medical understanding and social attitudes in the Tudor era. It wasn't just a disease, it was a devastating plague that brought disfigurement, agony and death, forever altering the landscape of intimacy and public health. The speed with which it spread across the continent, seemingly overnight, was terrifying, leaving medical practitioners baffled and populations gripped by fear. The most widely accepted theory for its sudden appearance in Europe traces its origins to the Americas, brought back by Columbus's sailors. This mainstream historical fact posits that the disease, previously endemic and less virulent in the New World, mutated or found a more susceptible host population in Europe. Within years of Columbus's return, accounts of a new horrific malady began to emerge, first among soldiers fighting in Naples in 1494, and then rapidly disseminating across trade routes and armies. It was a stark reminder of the unintended consequences of global exploration, a biological weapon unknowingly unleashed. The symptoms of the Great Pox were gruesome and undeniable. Initially a sore or chancre would appear, typically on the genitals, though it could occur elsewhere. This might be followed by a rash, often involving the palms of the hands and soles of the feet, and flu-like symptoms. The secondary stage could involve lesions called gummata, which could affect bones, organs and the brain, leading to blindness, paralysis, dementia and ultimately death. The disfigurement, particularly to the face with the collapse of the nose, was a cruel and highly visible marker of the disease, leaving its victims horribly scarred and often shunned. Imagine trying to conduct courtly affairs or even daily life with a face literally rotting away, a living testament to a hidden sin. The devastating impact of syphilis fundamentally reshaped perceptions of sexual health. Before its arrival, sexual promiscuity carried risks, but none so terrifyingly disfiguring and fatal. The Great Pox introduced an unprecedented level of fear and stigma to illicit sexual encounters. It became a powerful moralizing agent, often framed as a divine punishment for sin, particularly for fornication and adultery. Preachers railed against immorality, pointing to the pox-ridden bodies as clear evidence of God's wrath. This moralistic interpretation only added to the suffering of those afflicted. who not only endured physical torment but also profound shame and social ostracism. Treatments for syphilis in the Tudor era were, by modern standards, rudimentary and often as dangerous as the disease itself. The most common treatment involved mercury, administered in various forms, as an ointment rubbed onto the skin, ingested as a pill, or inhaled as vapour in a sweating cure, where patients were enclosed in heated tubs with mercury fumes. The idea was to induce profuse sweating and salivation, believed to purge the body of the disease's poisons. This quirky tidbit about mercury treatment, while offering some temporary relief of symptoms for some patients, often led to severe mercury poisoning, causing tooth loss, neurological damage, kidney failure, and a host of other agonising side effects. Many patients likely died from the cure as much as from the disease, a grim testament to the desperate state of medicine at the time. It makes one truly appreciate modern antibiotics. A course of penicillin sounds infinitely more appealing than a mercury sauna. Historians still argue whether the moral panic surrounding syphilis was primarily a reflection of genuine public health concerns or a convenient tool for social control, particularly regarding female sexuality. While the disease was undoubtedly horrific, the intensity of the moral condemnation, often directed disproportionately at women, who are frequently blamed for its spread, suggests that societal anxieties about illicit sex were amplified and redirected through the lens of this new plague. The debate highlights the complex interplay between medical knowledge, social anxieties, and patriarchal power structures. The term pox-ridden became a common descriptor, synonymous with moral decay and physical corruption. Those suffering from the advanced stages of syphilis were often confined to pox houses or hospitals dedicated to infectious diseases, further isolating them from society. Beggars with visible signs of the disease would elicit a mixture of pity and revulsion, serving as living warnings against vice. The sheer visibility of the disease in its later stages made it impossible to ignore, forcing a reckoning with the consequences of sexual activity outside the idealized marital bond. The arrival of syphilis also prompted some of the earliest public health measures, rudimentary as they were. Concerns about its spread led to attempts at regulating bathhouses and brothels, though these efforts were often inconsistent and ineffective. Physicians, despite their limited understanding, grappled with charting its course and attempting to find more effective remedies. It spurred a burgeoning interest in venereal diseases, laying some of the groundwork for later medical understanding, even if early treatments were brutal. The cultural impact of syphilis was immense. It appeared in literature, plays, and popular ballads, often as a cautionary tale of lust and its grim consequences. The visible signs of the disease, the decaying flesh, the lost nose, became powerful symbols of moral depravity and divine retribution. This cultural representation reinforced the stigma and fear, shaping how people viewed sexual contact and those who engaged in what was deemed illicit activity. It contributed to a heightened sense of vigilance and suspicion regarding the body and its vulnerabilities. Despite the pervasive fear, clandestine sexual activity certainly did not cease. Human desire, as ever, found ways around moral strictures and the threat of disease. However, the shadow of the Great Pox undoubtedly added a terrifying new dimension to such encounters, turning a moment of pleasure into a potential death sentence. The risk-reward calculation for illicit sex fundamentally shifted. Even within marriage, the threat of syphilis loomed. If one partner contracted the disease through infidelity, it could then be passed to the innocent spouse, leading to tragic consequences for entire families. This possibility further underscored the importance of fidelity within marriage, and added another layer of anxiety to marital relations, especially if one partner was suspected of straying. The disease was a silent destroyer, capable of unravelling domestic harmony and exposing hidden transgressions. The legacy of syphilis in the Tudor era is complex. It was a catalyst for fear, a driver of moral reform, and a spur to early medical inquiry. It exposed the vulnerabilities of the human body and the limitations of contemporary medicine. Perhaps most significantly, it indelibly marked the public consciousness with a new and horrifying consequence of sexual activity, forever linking notions of pleasure with the potential for agonizing, disfiguring death. The Great Pox became a grim, silent participant in every intimate encounter, a constant reminder of the fine line between desire and destruction. In a world before reliable contraception and safe medical procedures, The management of fertility in Tudor England was a precarious and often desperate endeavour. Without the knowledge or technology that we take for granted today, people resorted to a bewildering array of methods, ranging from folk remedies and superstitions to harsh, often life-threatening, procedures to prevent or terminate pregnancies. The desire to control one's reproductive destiny was ever present, driven by economic necessity, social pressures, and the simple struggle for survival, particularly for women. For most, the primary method of contraception was abstinence, either within or outside marriage, a practice often encouraged by the Church for spiritual reasons during certain periods, such as Lent. However, as human nature dictates, abstinence was not always a feasible or desirable option. Within marriage, the rhythm method, or coitus interruptus, might have been intuitively practiced by some, though without any scientific understanding of ovulation cycles, its effectiveness would have been purely accidental. It's a bit like playing reproductive roulette in the dark, hoping for the best. More tangible, though highly questionable, methods involved a fascinating mix of herbal concoctions and superstitious practices. Women might consume various plant-based remedies, often brewed as teas or infusions, in the belief that they could prevent conception or induce menstruation, thus acting as an abortifacient. Pennyroyal, rue, tansy, and savin were among the herbs commonly cited in historical texts and folk traditions for their amenagogic, menstruation-inducing, or abortifacient properties. However, the dosages were imprecise, the effects often unpredictable, and many of these herbs were highly toxic, leading to severe illness, poisoning, or even death for the woman. It's a chilling reminder of the desperate lengths to which people would go, often risking their lives, in the absence of safer alternatives. Beyond herbs, various bizarre and unscientific methods were also employed, reflecting the pervasive influence of folk medicine and superstition. Some women might have inserted objects into the vagina, or consumed strange mixtures involving animal parts or even certain minerals, all based on misguided beliefs about their contraceptive or abortive powers. The sheer variety and often horrifying nature of these methods underscore the profound lack of understanding of human biology and the immense vulnerability of women during this period. One imagines a desperate woman, listening to whispers in the marketplace, trying anything, no matter how outlandish, to avoid another pregnancy. The concept of abortion, as distinct from contraception, was not as clearly defined or widely discussed as it is today. If a woman missed her menstrual period, she might first try methods to bring on her courses, effectively attempting to induce an early miscarriage before the pregnancy was visibly established, or quickening, the point at which fetal movement was felt, had occurred. Once quickening happened, typically around the 4th or 5th month, the fetus was considered to have a soul, and any attempt to terminate the pregnancy thereafter was seen as equivalent to murder by the Church, carrying severe penalties. This mainstream historical fact highlights the moral and legal distinctions drawn based on the perceived stage of fetal development. However, despite these religious and legal prescriptions, clandestine abortions certainly occurred. These procedures would have been performed by local wise women, midwives, or even the women themselves, often with crude instruments and unsanitary conditions, leading to high rates of infection, hemorrhage, and death. The methods employed were often violent and traumatic, designed to dislodge the fetus, reflecting a brutal lack of medical understanding. It's a grim picture, one of profound risk and often tragic outcomes for those seeking to end an unwanted pregnancy. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to fertility control is the belief in various amulets, charms, and rituals to prevent conception or ensure barrenness. Women might wear certain stones, carry specific herbs, or perform rituals under a particular phase of the moon, believing these actions possessed mystical power to ward off pregnancy. Conversely, other charms and rituals were used to promote fertility, highlighting the dual anxieties surrounding conception. These practices, while seemingly fantastical to modern minds, were deeply embedded in the everyday lives of Tudors, reflecting a world where the line between magic and medicine was often blurred, and where people sought control over their bodies through whatever means available. One can almost picture a woman, perhaps a little ironically, meticulously preparing a charm for barrenness before a clandestine meeting, hoping for the best but relying on magical thinking. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of these methods of fertility control indicates a widespread desire for family planning, or reflects the desperate circumstances of women who had few other options in a society where large families were often a burden. While the concept of individual reproductive rights is a modern one, the sheer existence and variety of these practices suggest that people were actively, if dangerously, attempting to manage their fertility, even if the underlying motivations were often driven by survival rather than personal choice. The legal repercussions for those involved in abortion, especially if discovered, could be severe. While direct charges of murder might be difficult to prove if the fetus had not quickened, women could face charges of concealment of birth, fornication, or other moral offences, leading to public penance, fines, or even imprisonment. Those who assisted in abortions also faced legal and social condemnation. The threat of discovery and punishment acted as a powerful deterrent, forcing these practices further into the shadows. It's important to remember the context of high infant and maternal mortality rates in Tudor England. Childbirth itself was a dangerous journey, and many women died in labour or from complications afterwards. Large families were common, but many children did not survive to adulthood. This grim reality meant that, for many women, repeated pregnancies were not just a burden, but a direct threat to their lives and health. The desire to space out pregnancies or avoid them entirely was therefore not a luxury, but often a matter of survival. The male role in contraception was virtually non-existent, at least in documented methods. The onus and the danger of fertility control fell almost entirely upon women. This imbalance of responsibility reflects the patriarchal nature of Tudor society, where women's bodies were often viewed as instruments of reproduction, and their reproductive lives largely controlled by men or societal expectations. The burdens, both physical and emotional, were almost exclusively theirs. In essence, the landscape of fertility control in Tudor England was one of stark choices and profound risks. Without scientific understanding or safe medical interventions, individuals, particularly women, navigated a perilous path, resorting to dangerous concoctions and desperate measures. The clandestine nature of these practices, born of necessity and fear, stands as a quiet testament to the enduring human desire to exert some control over the most fundamental aspects of life, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It's a sobering chapter in the history of human sexuality, reminding us of the immense progress in reproductive health that has been made since those dangerous, desperate times. In the tapestry of Tudor life, where faith, superstition, and burgeoning scientific thought intertwined, the belief in witchcraft and the efficacy of love potions cast a curious shadow over matters of the heart and bedroom. Far from being mere whimsical notions, these practices were deeply rooted in a worldview that attributed unexplained phenomena, including sudden affections or inexplicable barrenness, to unseen forces and the manipulations of cunning individuals. They represented a desperate human attempt to exert control over the chaotic and often uncontrollable forces of desire, fertility, and even marital harmony. The concept of witchcraft in Tudor England was pervasive and terrifying. Witches were believed to possess malevolent powers derived from a pact with the devil, capable of casting spells that could cause illness, blight crops, or, crucially for our narrative, influence sexual desire and reproductive capabilities. Accusations of bewitchment often arose in cases of inexplicable impotence, barrenness within a marriage, or sudden obsessive affections that seemed to defy rational explanation. If a husband suddenly found himself unable to perform his marital duties, or a wife failed to conceive despite all efforts, the whisper of a witch's curse might quickly spread through the community. This fear was very real, leading to numerous witch trials throughout the period, where the accused faced brutal interrogations and often a grim end. Love potions, on the other hand, represented a more benign, though equally illicit, form of magical intervention. These concoctions, often brewed from herbs, animal parts, or even bodily fluids, were intended to ignite passion, secure a reluctant lover, or ensure fidelity. They were the desperate recourse of the lovelorn, the insecure or the ambitious, hoping to sway fate in their favour. Imagine a young woman, perhaps hopelessly smitten, secretly brewing a potent mixture, hoping to capture the attention of a desired suitor. It's a scene straight out of a fantastical tale, yet for many it was a genuine attempt to influence their romantic destiny. The use of charms and spells extended beyond potions. People might carry specific amulets, write incantations, or perform rituals at certain times of the day or phases of the moon, all designed to influence love or fertility. Some might even seek out cunning folk or white witches, individuals believed to possess benevolent magical powers, to counteract a perceived curse or to cast a positive spell. This mainstream historical fact highlights the widespread belief in magic as a tangible force in daily life, capable of affecting intimate relationships as much as harvests or health. However, the Church condemned all forms of magic, whether malevolent or ostensibly benevolent, as the work of the devil. Seeking magical assistance for love or fertility was considered idolatry and a grave sin. Those caught practicing or even dabbling in such arts faced the wrath of the ecclesiastical courts, risking penance, public humiliation, or even more severe legal consequences, particularly if their actions were linked to witchcraft accusations. This created a perilous tightrope for those who sought supernatural aid, balancing desperate hope against profound risk. A quirky or fringe tidbit concerning love magic relates to the bizarre ingredients believed to enhance passion or fertility. One rather unsavoury example involved consuming dried and powdered parts of specific animals, such as sparrows, thought to be highly amorous, or mandrake root, believed to resemble a human figure and possess potent magical properties. Another involved more personal, intimate ingredients, like menstrual blood or nail clippings, mixed into drinks or food. These practices, while certainly unappetizing, underscore the deep-seated belief in sympathetic magic, the idea that like affects like, and the desperate lengths to which people would go to influence affairs of the heart and body. It's enough to make one pause before accepting a stranger's homemade brew, even if it promises eternal devotion. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of witchcraft accusations related to sexual matters reflected genuine fear of malefic magic, or was a convenient outlet for societal anxieties about female power, promiscuity, or the inability to control human desire. Was it a genuine belief in dark arts, or was it a way to explain away unfortunate circumstances and punish women who deviated from social norms? The debate highlights how deeply gender roles and societal expectations intertwined with superstitious beliefs, often to the detriment of women. The belief that impotence or barrenness could be caused by witchcraft, specifically by a witch tying the points of a man, a metaphorical binding of his virility, or closing a woman's womb, was widespread. This provided a convenient explanation for reproductive failures that otherwise might have been attributed to God's displeasure, or, unthinkable at the time, a problem with the man himself. Such accusations offered a scapegoat, allowing communities to attribute personal misfortunes to an external malevolent force. The witch, in these cases, became the embodiment of thwarted desire and unfulfilled familial obligations. Conversely, some magical practices were aimed at ensuring a successful marriage and numerous offspring. Brides might carry specific herbs or perform small rituals on their wedding day to ensure fertility and a happy union. These were generally less condemned than overtly love potion magic, as they aligned with the societal expectation of marriage and procreation. The line between harmless superstition and dangerous magic was often fluid, defined largely by intent and outcome. The very concept of free will and individual choice in love was often overshadowed by these beliefs. If someone was under a love spell, were they truly responsible for their actions? This question rarely received a nuanced answer, as the prevailing view leaned heavily on the idea of divine punishment for transgressions, regardless of external influence. The individual was still held accountable, even if under supernatural sway. The fear of being bewitched into an unwanted marriage or a state of unnatural desire also added a layer of paranoia to social interactions. A sudden, inexplicable attraction might be viewed with suspicion, not as genuine affection, but as the result of a subtle enchantment. This distrust could erode social bonds and lead to accusations, further fueling the cycle of fear and suspicion that characterised the era's engagement with magic. In the royal court, while direct accusations of love magic might have been less common, replaced instead by intricate political manoeuvres, the underlying anxieties about fertility and succession remained paramount. If a queen struggled to conceive, whispered theories about curses or divine displeasure were never far from the surface. The pressure to produce an heir, as we've seen, was so immense that any perceived impediment, natural or supernatural, would be scrutinised with intense anxiety. Ultimately, the belief in witchcraft and love potions reflected a desperate human yearning for control, in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. When love remained unrequited, or a womb remained stubbornly barren, people turned to whatever means they believed might offer a solution, however dangerous or illusory. These practices, condemned by the Church yet embraced by many, highlight the enduring power of folk belief and the human tendency to seek magical explanations when rational ones elude us, shaping the most intimate aspects of Tudor life in ways that continue to intrigue and sometimes disturb us. Adultery in Tudor England was not merely a private marital transgression. It was a deeply serious moral, social, and sometimes legal offence, carrying immense shame and severe repercussions, particularly for women, in a society where marriage was seen as a sacred covenant, a foundational pillar of order, and the primary legitimate context for sexual activity. Infidelity threatened the very fabric of community, family lineage, and divine favour. The consequences of straying outside the marital bond could be devastating, often more so than the fleeting pleasure of the illicit act itself. For women, the consequences of adultery were almost universally ruinous. A wife discovered in an adulterous liaison faced immediate and profound social ostracisation. Her reputation would be irrevocably stained, making her an object of scorn and gossip. She could be cast out by her husband, lose custody of her children, and forfeit any claim to her dowry or jointure, potentially condemning her to destitution. The very identity of a woman in Tudor society was inextricably linked to her chastity and fidelity within marriage. To violate these was to lose her standing, her respectability, and often her livelihood. It was a societal death sentence, more painful perhaps than a physical one for some. Men, while technically also guilty of adultery in the eyes of the Church, typically faced far less severe consequences, reflecting the patriarchal double standard of the era. A husband's infidelity, while frowned upon, might be tolerated or discreetly overlooked, especially if it did not involve bringing an illegitimate child into the household. He might be admonished by the Church or face social censure, but his reputation, property and standing were rarely as irrevocably damaged as a woman's. This mainstream historical fact highlights the vast gender imbalance in how sexual morality was policed and punished. It's enough to make one sigh at the persistent unfairness of historical gender roles. The Church played a pivotal role in prosecuting adultery. Ecclesiastical courts held jurisdiction over moral offences, and individuals accused of adultery could be summoned to face charges. Proof, often based on witness testimony or public rumour, could lead to various forms of penance. The most common and humiliating was public penance, where the adulterer, and often the female adulteress in particular, would be forced to stand before the congregation during a church service, dressed in a white sheet, often holding a white wand, and confess their sin. This ritual of public shame was designed not only to punish the individual, but also to serve as a stark warning to others, reinforcing communal moral boundaries. Imagine the whispers, the pointed fingers, the burning humiliation. It was a potent form of social control. Beyond spiritual penalties, legal repercussions, though less common for ordinary folk, could also apply. Adultery, while not a capital crime in itself, could lead to legal separation, though not divorce with the right to remarry, and in some extreme cases, particularly for noble women, could result in imprisonment or house arrest. The primary legal concern, especially for propertied families, was the legitimacy of heirs. Adultery by a wife cast doubt on the paternity of her children, threatening the purity of the bloodline and the rightful inheritance of property and titles. This made female fidelity absolutely paramount for the integrity of aristocratic families. A quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the unusual methods sometimes employed by suspicious husbands to prove infidelity, particularly in cases where a wife was accused of having conceived a child with another man. While direct proof was difficult, some folk beliefs suggested that a woman who conceived through adultery might give birth to a child with physical characteristics distinctly different from her husband, almost as a biological mark of her transgression. Such unsubstantiated beliefs, while lacking any scientific basis, illustrate the deep anxieties surrounding paternity and the lengths to which people would go to find proof of infidelity, even if it meant resorting to pseudoscience or superstition. Historians still argue whether the extreme penalties for female adultery were solely a reflection of patriarchal control over women's bodies and reproduction, or also stemmed from a genuine concern for social stability and the clear establishment of legitimate lineage in a world without DNA testing. While the former is undeniable, the latter also played a significant role, particularly in an era where inheritance was everything. The debate highlights the complex motivations behind legal and social norms. The royal court, a constant hotbed of intrigue and ambition, saw adultery play out with deadly consequences. Henry VIII's relentless pursuit of a male heir, as we know, led him to accuse Anne Boleyn of adultery and incest, charges widely believed by modern historians to have been fabricated or wildly exaggerated. Yet, the accusation itself, whether true or false, was potent enough to secure her conviction and execution. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, faced similar charges which, this time, were likely true, leading to her swift and brutal demise. For queens, adultery was treason, a direct threat to the sanctity of the royal line and the stability of the realm. The punishment was not public penance but the axe. The fear of cuckoldry, a husband being deceived by his wife, was a recurring theme in Tudor literature and popular culture, often played for comic effect in plays and ballads, but deeply shaming in reality. A cuckolded husband was an object of ridicule, his virility and authority questioned. This public humiliation served to reinforce the societal expectation of female fidelity. The horns of the cuckold were a vivid symbol of male dishonour, a visible, though imaginary, marker of his wife's transgression. In contrast, male extramarital affairs, while not openly condoned, were often normalised, especially for powerful men. Kings and noblemen frequently kept mistresses, and while these relationships might cause scandal or jealousy within the court, they rarely resulted in the same catastrophic consequences for the man himself. Indeed, the king's mistresses often held considerable influence, and their illegitimate children, if acknowledged, might even be granted titles and lands, as we've seen with Henry Fitzroy. This double standard underscores the deeply ingrained gender inequality inherent in Tudor sexual mores. Divorce, as a means to escape an adulterous spouse, was virtually impossible, while legal separations a mensa et thoro, from bed and board, could be granted by ecclesiastical courts in cases of adultery, cruelty or desertion. These did not allow either party to remarry. The marriage bond, once formed, was considered indissoluble. This lack of legal recourse meant that individuals trapped in unhappy or unfaithful marriages often had few options, leading to lives of quiet desperation or forcing the adoption of clandestine, dangerous liaisons. In essence, adultery in Tudor England was a moral minefield, particularly for women. It was a sin against God, a crime against the family, and a threat to social order. The severe punishments and pervasive shame associated with it highlight a society deeply concerned with controlling female sexuality and ensuring the legitimacy of its lineage. The dramatic fates of queens and the quiet desperation of ordinary women alike serve as a powerful testament to the unforgiving consequences of straying from the prescribed path of marital fidelity. It paints a picture of a society that policed its bedrooms with as much fervour as its borders. In Tudor England, the seemingly innocuous topic of clothing was, in fact, a powerful visual language, meticulously regulated by a series of laws known as sumptuary laws. These decrees, far from being mere fashion advice, subtly yet profoundly influence perceptions of sexuality, social status, and moral propriety. They dictated not only what people could wear, but also who could wear it, often serving as a silent, visible barometer of one's standing in the rigid social hierarchy and, by extension, their perceived sexual morality. The primary aim of sumptuary laws was to maintain social order and prevent social mobility through outward display. They prescribed specific types of fabrics, colours, furs, and ornamentation for different social classes, ensuring that a nobleman could not be mistaken for a wealthy merchant, nor a respectable gentlewoman for someone of lesser standing. This mainstream historical fact highlights a society obsessed with visible markers of hierarchy, a world where your clothes quite literally told your story, or at least the story the authorities wanted you to tell. It was an era before social media, so your outfit was your carefully curated profile picture, and woe betide anyone who tried to punch above their sartorial weight. Yet, beyond this obvious class distinction, sumptuary laws also carried an implicit and sometimes explicit sexual undertone. Certain garments or styles could be associated with immodesty, vanity, or even promiscuity, particularly for women. For instance, low necklines, excessive exposure of the bosom, or overly luxurious fabrics on women of a lower status might be seen as attempts to entice, to draw undue attention, and thus to signal a lack of moral rectitude. While not directly prohibiting specific sexual acts, these laws subtly shaped a visual code of modesty and virtue, using clothing as a tool to police public displays of female sexuality. The choice of fabric itself carried sexual connotations. Silk, velvet, and intricate laces were reserved for the elite, conveying wealth and refinement. To see someone of lower rank attempting to wear such finery was not just an affront to class distinctions. It was often viewed as a form of social climbing that could also imply moral looseness, particularly if a woman used such clothing to attract men of higher status. The act of dressing was therefore laden with hidden meanings, a quiet commentary on one's aspirations and, implicitly, one's sexual availability or desirability. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the use of codpieces for men. While sumptuary laws primarily focused on women's attire for their moral implications, the codpiece, a padded and often ostentatiously decorated pouch covering the male genitals, was a prominent and highly sexualized feature of male fashion, particularly during Henry VIII's reign. Far from being discreet, some codpieces were exaggerated in size and adorned with jewels, ribbons, or embroidery, explicitly drawing attention to the male anatomy. This sartorial choice, while not regulated by sumptuary law per se in terms of its existence, was a powerful statement of male virility and status, reflecting an era where male potency was celebrated, especially for the king who desperately needed heirs. Imagine walking around with a giant bejeweled arrow pointing directly at your crotch, a surprisingly bold fashion statement for a seemingly prudish era. It's almost a sartorial wink and a nod, if you will, to the era's obsession with male fertility. Historians still argue whether sumptuary laws were truly effective in controlling social behaviour and sexual display, or if they were largely unenforceable and symbolic gestures by authorities struggling to maintain order in a rapidly changing society. While infractions were noted and some prosecutions occurred, the sheer difficulty of policing everyone's wardrobe suggests a gap between legislative intent and practical reality. The debate highlights the persistent human desire to express individuality, even under the shadow of restrictive laws. For courtesans and prostitutes, clothing could serve as a deliberate marker of their profession, sometimes by official decree, as we saw with the Winchester geese in their distinctive striped hoods, or sometimes by their own choice, as a way to advertise their availability. While respectable women were expected to be modestly attired, women of the street might use brighter colours, more revealing styles, or borrowed finery to attract clients, thus subverting the very purpose of sumptuary laws by using clothing to signal, rather than conceal, their illicit trade. The moralists and preachers of the day constantly railed against extravagant or immodest dress, viewing it as a sign of spiritual decay and a temptation to lust. Sermons condemned women who adorned themselves too richly or exposed too much flesh, arguing that such attire led men into sin. This religious condemnation added a powerful layer of moral judgment to sartorial choices, making fashion not just a matter of taste but a matter of salvation. It was a constant battle between human vanity and divine injunction. Even accessories played a role. Jewellery, particularly pearls and precious stones, was strictly regulated, often reserved for those of noble birth. To wear such items inappropriately might not directly indicate sexual impropriety, but it certainly implied a transgression of social boundaries, which could in turn lead to suspicions about how such illicit wealth was obtained, possibly through immoral means. The smallest detail of one's outfit could speak volumes. The evolving silhouettes of Tudor fashion also subtly communicated ideas about the body and sexuality. The stiff, structured bodices and farthingales of the later Tudor period created an almost architectural silhouette, emphasising a rigid, controlled female form. This contrasted with the softer, more flowing styles of earlier periods. One could interpret this shift as a visual manifestation of a society attempting to exert greater control over women's bodies and their public presentation, a move towards greater restraint and less overt sensuality, at least in the upper classes. The power of clothing to indicate marital status was also significant. Married women would typically wear specific head coverings, such as coifs or hoods, differentiating them from unmarried women who might wear their hair uncovered or styled differently. This visual cue was not necessarily sexual, but it reinforced social distinctions related to one's availability and place within the established social order. A woman's headwear, therefore, was a silent declaration of her status, telling onlookers whether she was eligible or already taken. In moments of extreme social policing, women accused of sexual transgressions such as adultery or fornication might be forced to wear specific garments or symbols of shame during public penance, like the aforementioned white sheet. This ritualistic stripping away of their normal attire and replacing it with a marker of disgrace was a powerful act of public humiliation, designed to strip them of their dignity and reinforce communal moral standards. The clothing became a costume of shame, a visible manifestation of their perceived sin. In conclusion, sumptuary laws and the broader etiquette of dress in Tudor England were far more than just rules about fabric and style. They were intricate social codes that subtly, and sometimes explicitly, communicated messages about wealth, status, and morality. In a world without widespread literacy, visual cues were paramount, and clothing served as a potent, silent language, constantly shaping and reflecting the era's complex and often contradictory attitudes towards sexuality and its public display. To understand Tudor sexual practices, one must also look at the silks, the velvets, and even the audacious codpieces, for they too tell a story of desire, control, and societal expectation. The topic of homosexuality in Tudor England, while rarely openly discussed and certainly not accepted, is one shrouded in secrecy, societal condemnation, and the ever-present threat of severe punishment. In an era dominated by strict religious dogma and an overwhelming emphasis on procreation within marriage, same-sex relationships were deemed unnatural and sodomy considered grave sins against God and nature. Yet, despite the pervasive hostility, evidence suggests that same-sex desire and relationships in various forms persisted, often hidden beneath a veneer of conformity, or occasionally surfacing with devastating consequences. The legal framework for punishing homosexual acts, particularly male sodomy, was draconian. The Buggery Act of 1533, enacted during Henry VIII's reign, criminalised the detestable and abominable vice of buggery committed with mankind or beast. This mainstream historical fact codified what had previously been primarily an ecclesiastical offence, making it a secular felony punishable by death. This act, driven perhaps by Henry VIII's desire to assert state control over moral matters previously handled by the Church, created a terrifying precedent, ensuring that male homosexual acts carried the ultimate penalty. It's a stark reminder of how violently the state could enforce its moral code. For women, the legal situation regarding same-sex relations was less clear-cut, largely because female homosexuality was often invisible to the patriarchal legal system. While theoretically condemned as a sin, it rarely garnered the same legal attention or capital punishment as male sodomy. This isn't to say it was accepted, but rather that it was often either ignored or simply not understood as a distinct crime in the same way. The focus of the law, and indeed much of society's anxiety, was overwhelmingly on male sexual acts, reflecting a deeply ingrained patriarchal bias, and perhaps a fear of anything that deviated from male-dominated procreative norms. Despite the severe penalties, it's generally accepted that same-sex relationships did exist. In a world where men and women often lived in gender-segregated environments, apprentices in workshops, soldiers in camps, women in tightly knit domestic spheres, intimate emotional and even physical bonds could form. These relationships, however, would have been conducted with extreme discretion, whispers in the dark, lest they attract the lethal attention of authorities. The risk involved in expressing such desires was immense, forcing individuals into lives of profound concealment and self-denial. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period relates to the passionate language often used in male friendships, particularly in correspondence between noblemen or scholars. Letters between men might express deep affection, longing, and even romantic sentiments that, to modern eyes, could suggest homosexual attachment. However, in the Tudor context, such intense expressions of platonic male bonding were more culturally acceptable and do not necessarily indicate sexual relationships. It highlights the challenge of interpreting historical emotional landscapes through contemporary lenses, and the subtle lines between intense friendship and romantic love in a pre-modern world. Historians still argue whether such language truly masks same-sex relationships, or if it was simply a prevalent cultural norm for expressing strong non-sexual affection among men. The debate underscores the difficulty in definitively identifying sexual orientation in a period where the very concepts of homosexual and heterosexual as fixed identities did not exist as they do today. The dominant religious narrative vehemently condemned sodomy as an unnatural act, a perversion that offended God and threatened the natural order. Preachers and moralists thundered against it, often linking it to other perceived sins and societal decay. The belief that natural disasters or plagues could be divine punishment for such transgressions further reinforced the fear and condemnation. This pervasive theological disapproval ensured that anyone engaging in such acts lived in constant fear of discovery and the ensuing spiritual and temporal damnation. In the royal court, while Henry VIII's personal life was consumed by his quest for a male heir through various wives, the undercurrents of same-sex desire likely existed, albeit in an even more secretive and dangerous form. Any hint of such behaviour amongst the nobility could be exploited by political rivals, leading to accusations and ruin. Figures like James III, a later monarch who openly favoured male companions, would have been unimaginable in the hyper-vigilant and religiously conservative Tudor court. The potential for blackmail and political leverage would have been immense, turning intimate preferences into fatal vulnerabilities. The lives of those who harboured same-sex desires must have been profoundly isolated. There was no concept of a gay community or support networks as we understand them today. Individuals grappling with these feelings would have been entirely alone, internalising societal condemnation and often wrestling with intense guilt and fear. The psychological toll of living in such profound secrecy, under the shadow of capital punishment, is almost unimaginable. While the Buggery Act specifically targeted male sodomy, other forms of unnatural sexual behaviour, including bestiality, were also covered. The very grouping of these acts under a single abhorrent label highlights the era's broad condemnation of non-procreative sexual expression and anything that deviated from prescribed marital norms. The law was less about precise definitions of sexual acts and more about crushing anything deemed a perversion of God's design. Punishment for buggery was execution, often by burning or hanging, a brutal public spectacle intended as a deterrent and a purification ritual for the community. Such events were grim reminders of the state's absolute power over the body and its perceived moral transgressions. The memory of such punishments would have served as a powerful deterrent, forcing many desires deep into the closet, never to see the light of day. It is crucial to approach this topic with sensitivity, recognising the historical context without condoning the bigotry and violence of the past. The lack of open discussion and the severity of the legal framework mean that much of what we know about same-sex experiences in Tudor England is gleaned from fragmentary legal records, condemnations in moral tracts, or very subtle hints in personal correspondence. We are looking at shadows and whispers rather than clear statements. In conclusion, homosexuality in Tudor England existed in a deeply repressive environment. Under the ominous shadow of the Buggery Act and the pervasive condemnation of the Church, same-sex desires and relationships were driven underground, forcing individuals into lives of extreme secrecy and fear. The consequences of discovery were horrific, leading to a profound absence of visible evidence and leaving modern historians to piece together a fragmented and often tragic narrative of love and desire that dared not speak its name. It's a grim testament to the oppressive force of societal norms, a reminder that the most intimate aspects of human existence can be brutally policed. In Tudor England, the notion of divorce, as we understand it today, a legal dissolution of marriage, granting both parties the right to remarry, was virtually non-existent. The Church, which held absolute sway over marital matters, considered marriage a sacred, indissoluble sacrament, a bond what therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. This theological bedrock meant that once a couple was legally married, their union was intended to last till death do us part. However, while outright divorce was prohibited, avenues for escaping unhappy or unworkable marriages did exist, primarily through the complex and often contentious process of annulment, which effectively declared a marriage null and void from its inception. An annulment, or a decree of nullity, was fundamentally different from divorce. It argued that a valid marriage had in fact never occurred due to some pre-existing impediment at the time of the wedding. These impediments could be various, Pre-contract, one party was already legally betrothed to someone else. Consanguinity, too close blood relation. Or affinity, too close relation by marriage. Impotence or non-consummation, or coercion, lack of true consent. If successfully proven in an ecclesiastical court, the annulment meant that the parties were free to marry again, as if their previous union had never happened. This mainstream historical fact became the central battleground for marital disputes, particularly among the elite. The most famous and certainly the most politically charged annulment battle of the Tudor era was, of course, that of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Henry's fervent desire for a male heir, coupled with his growing affection for Anne Boleyn, led him to question the validity of his marriage to Catherine. His argument hinged on the biblical prohibition in Leviticus against a man marrying his brother's wife. Despite a papal dispensation having been granted for their marriage decades earlier, Henry, guided by his conscience, or perhaps convenience, asserted that the Pope had no power to override divine law. This protracted legal and theological struggle ultimately led to the monumental break with the Roman Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England, irrevocably altering the religious and political landscape of the nation. It illustrates how profoundly a royal bedroom dispute could shape the destiny of an entire realm. For ordinary people, seeking an annulment was an arduous and expensive process, largely confined to the well-to-do who could afford legal representation, and the protracted court proceedings in the ecclesiastical courts. The burden of proof lay heavily on the petitioner, who had to demonstrate beyond doubt that a valid impediment existed at the time of the marriage. Witnesses would be called, evidence presented, and the intricate nuances of canon law debated. It was a labyrinthine journey, often taking years, leaving those involved in a state of legal and personal limbo. Cruelty or physical abuse within a marriage, while recognised as grounds for a divortium mensa thoro, separation from bed and board, did not grant either party the right to remarry. This type of separation simply allowed the couple to live apart, but the marriage bond remained intact. For many women trapped in violent or abusive marriages, this was often the only legal recourse available, offering physical separation but no true freedom to rebuild their lives with another partner. The absence of true divorce left many individuals in a perpetual state of marital purgatory. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to annulment battles is the reliance on highly personal and often crude physical examinations, particularly in cases of alleged non-consummation or impotence. When a man claimed impotence as a ground for annulment, both parties might be subjected to medical inspection, sometimes even in front of court officials, to ascertain the truth of the claim. Similarly, in cases of alleged non-consummation, a jury of matrons might be appointed to physically examine the woman to determine if she was still a virgin. These invasive and humiliating procedures underscore the lengths to which the legal system would go to establish facts in the absence of modern medical diagnostics, turning the most intimate details of a person's body into public evidence. It's an almost unbelievably intrusive practice, making one wince at the lack of privacy. Historians still argue whether the concept of impotence in Tudor annulment cases was primarily a genuine medical concern or often a convenient legal fiction employed by those seeking to escape an unwanted marriage, particularly when a male heir was desired and none forthcoming. While true medical impotence certainly existed, the fluidity of its definition and the highly personal nature of its proof leave room for speculation about how often it was genuinely established versus strategically leveraged. This debate highlights the challenges of interpreting the motivations behind legal proceedings in an era so different from our own. The political dimensions of royal marriages and their potential annulments cannot be overstated. When Anne of Cleves's marriage to Henry VIII was annulled, it was swiftly executed on grounds of a pre-contract to a German duke and Henry's alleged lack of consent and non-consummation, despite both parties publicly stating the marriage was unconsummated. This rapid resolution, starkly contrasting the decades-long battle over Catherine of Aragon, demonstrates how political expediency and a king's will could dramatically accelerate legal processes, bending the rules to suit the monarch's agenda. The law, in these high-stakes cases, truly served the crown. For the vast majority of the population, unhappy marriages were simply endured. Societal pressure, religious injunctions, and the sheer economic impossibility of separation or annulment meant that most couples, even those profoundly miserable, remained together. Desertion by one spouse was a common, albeit illegal, response to an unbearable union, often leaving the deserted party in dire straits, with no legal recourse to remarry. The sanctity of marriage, while offering a framework for stability, also imposed a rigid and often unyielding constraint on individual lives. The role of family and community in marital disputes was also significant. Rather than immediate legal action, neighbours, friends and local parish officials might first attempt to mediate disputes, counsel reconciliation, or pressure an errant spouse to return. The desire to maintain social harmony within the village or town often trumped the immediate rush to legal proceedings, at least for minor infractions. In essence, divorce in the modern sense was a foreign concept in Tudor England. Marital dissolution, if it occurred, almost exclusively took the form of an annulment, a complex, costly and often invasive legal battle. This system, deeply entrenched in canon law and subservient to the prevailing religious morality, highlighted the supreme importance placed on the perceived indissolubility of marriage and the legitimacy of heirs. It was a world where escaping a marital bond was a privilege of the powerful, a testament to the fact that even the most intimate aspects of life were subject to the intricate machinations of law, religion, and politics. While official Tudor morality championed the sanctity of marriage and condemned sexual relations outside its confines, the reality, particularly at the highest echelons of society, presented a more nuanced and often hypocritical picture. The existence of courtesans and royal mistresses, though often discreet, was an undeniable feature of courtly life, highlighting a pervasive double standard where powerful men enjoyed a degree of sexual license largely denied to women. These relationships, while lacking the legal and religious sanction of marriage, could wield considerable political and social influence, shaping personal destinies and, occasionally, the course of the realm. A courtesan, in the Tudor context, was not necessarily the highly refined, intellectually gifted companion of later centuries, but rather a woman who offered sexual favours, often in exchange for financial support, gifts, or social patronage. Unlike common prostitutes who operated in designated districts or on the streets, courtesans typically moved in higher social circles, sometimes even attending court, their presence a quiet testament to the less visible aspects of elite male sexuality. Their relationships with wealthy patrons or noblemen were often more sustained than casual encounters, sometimes involving the establishment of separate households and the provision of a comfortable, if precarious, lifestyle. Royal mistresses, however, occupied an even more sensitive and often dangerous position. To be the king's mistress was to hold a position of immense, albeit informal, power and prestige, but also to live under the constant shadow of royal capriciousness and political intrigue. They were privy to court secrets, could influence royal decisions, and might even serve as conduits for petitions and favours. Their allure was not merely physical, it was often a potent blend of beauty, wit, political acumen, and the mystique of forbidden intimacy. It's a bit like being a secret, influential advisor who also shares the monarch's bed, a thrilling but incredibly risky dual role. Henry VIII, despite his relentless pursuit of legitimate heirs and his public moralising, certainly kept mistresses. His relationship with Bessie Blount, which produced his acknowledged illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, is a prime example. This mainstream historical fact demonstrates that while the king demanded strict fidelity from his wives for the sake of succession, his own sexual conduct was subject to a different set of rules. Fitzroy was showered with titles and privileges, for a time even being considered as a potential heir if Catherine of Aragon failed to produce a surviving legitimate son. This highlights the paradox. Illegitimacy was condemned, yet the king's illegitimate offspring could still hold significant status, albeit without a claim to the throne. The influence of a royal mistress could be substantial. Anne Boleyn herself began her ascent to the throne as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, and it was her refusal to become merely Henry VIII's mistress and her demand for marriage that ultimately sparked the English Reformation. This demonstrates the powerful leverage a woman could potentially wield if she skillfully navigated the treacherous waters of courtly romance and royal desire. It was a high-stakes gamble, where the prize could be a crown or the axe. A quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the often elaborate gifts and financial provisions made for royal mistresses and their illegitimate children. These could include grants of land, annuities, expensive jewels and lavish households. While such generosity might seem to contradict the moral condemnation of their status, it was often a pragmatic decision by the monarch to ensure the discreet maintenance of his paramour and offspring, and to prevent public scandal that might destabilise the court. It was a form of hush money and patronage, designed to keep a delicate balance between public image and private indulgence. One can almost hear the sighs of exasperation from the royal treasury officials tasked with funding these discreet arrangements. Historians still argue whether the presence of royal mistresses genuinely reflected a relaxed attitude towards male infidelity within the courtly elite, or if it was merely a cynical projection of power, where the rules of morality simply did not apply to the monarch. While there was certainly an understanding that kings would have mistresses, the degree to which this was openly accepted versus quietly tolerated remains a point of scholarly debate, highlighting the inherent contradictions in Tudor morality. The lives of courtesans and mistresses were inherently precarious. Their status depended entirely on the continued favour of their powerful patrons. Should the patron lose interest, fall from power, or die, the woman could find herself abruptly stripped of her support, wealth, and influence, often left vulnerable and with limited options. The glittering facade of courtly life hid a harsh reality of dependency and insecurity for these women. Their beauty and charm were their only currency, and like all currencies, they could depreciate rapidly. For women aspiring to such a role, either for personal gain or out of genuine affection, the competition was fierce and the risks immense. They often navigated a treacherous landscape of jealousy, rivalry, and backstabbing from other women at court who coveted their position, or from those who adhered more strictly to moral conventions. The court was a viper's nest, and a mistress, by her very nature, was a lightning rod for envy and resentment. The children born of these illicit relationships, while technically illegitimate, often fared better than those born to commoners, especially if acknowledged by their powerful fathers. As we've seen, royal bastards like Henry Fitzroy were integrated to a degree into the social fabric, sometimes even educated alongside legitimate heirs. However, their ultimate lack of claim to legitimate inheritance, particularly the throne, remained a constant, insurmountable barrier. Their lives were a peculiar blend of privilege and perpetual marginalisation. The public perception of mistresses and courtesans, while officially condemnatory, was likely more nuanced in practice. For some, they might have been seen as figures of fascination, embodying illicit glamour and power. For others, they were objects of moral outrage and pity. The narratives surrounding them were often shaped by gossip, rumour, and the prevailing moral anxieties of the time. The very existence of these relationships highlights the inherent tension between the stated ideals of Tudor society and its lived realities. While the church preached chastity and fidelity, and the law punished fornication, the most powerful men in the land often flouted these rules, creating an implicit understanding that for some, the rules were different. This created a complex moral landscape where official condemnation coexisted uneasily with unofficial acceptance, particularly when power and privilege were involved. In conclusion, the figures of courtesans and royal mistresses offer a fascinating, if morally ambiguous, glimpse into the sexual practices of the Tudor elite. Their lives, often glamorous yet always precarious, serve as a testament to the pervasive double standards of the era and the enduring power of desire, even in a society obsessed with moral purity and legitimate succession. They were women who operated outside the strict confines of marital convention, carving out a space for themselves, however dangerous, in a world that largely denied them sexual agency outside of traditional roles. Their stories, though often relegated to footnotes, are crucial to understanding the full, complex picture of Tudor sexuality. The Tudor understanding of human reproduction was a fascinating, often bewildering, blend of ancient Greek medical theories, folk wisdom, and nascent empirical observation, all filtered through a predominantly Christian theological lens. Before the advent of modern microscopy and detailed anatomical studies, the intricate processes of conception, gestation, and birth remained largely mysterious, leading to a rich tapestry of beliefs, some remarkably prescient, others wildly inaccurate. This limited scientific knowledge profoundly influenced everything from advice on conception to the management of pregnancy and the interpretation of infertility. The prevailing medical framework was based on the humoral theory, derived from Hippocrates and Galen. This theory posited that the human body was composed of 4 cardinal humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, and that health depended on their balance. Reproduction was also understood through this lens. Both men and women were believed to produce seed or seed-like fluid, which combined during intercourse to form a new individual. This mainstream historical fact meant that women were not simply passive vessels. They were thought to actively contribute material to the formation of the fetus, though the male contribution was generally considered the more potent and formative element. For conception to occur, it was believed that both partners needed to experience pleasure and produce their respective seed. The idea was that the female seed was released through orgasm, and that this was crucial for the seed's receptivity and the drawing in of the male seed. This emphasis on female pleasure, while perhaps surprising to modern ears given the era's general repression of female sexuality, was rooted in a practical, if flawed, understanding of biological necessity for conception. It wasn't about enjoyment for its own sake, but as a mechanism for procreation. Imagine the pressure, then, on a woman to perform to ensure conception, not just for her husband's pleasure, but for the very future of the lineage. The male seed, or semen, was often considered the primary formative agent, containing the blueprint for the new individual, with the female providing the matter or nutriment for its growth. The male contribution was thought to carry the essence of the family line, reinforcing patriarchal notions of inheritance and lineage. This belief system implicitly placed the burden of male barrenness less on the man himself, and more on the quality or quantity of his seed, or even on external factors like witchcraft, as we've explored. It was never quite his fault, was it? A quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the pervasive belief in maternal impression, or imagination. This theory held that a pregnant woman's thoughts, emotions, and even sights could directly influence the development and appearance of her fetus. If a pregnant woman saw something frightening, or harboured strong desires or fears, it was believed these could leave physical marks or deformities on the child, or even influence its temperament. This led to advice for pregnant women to avoid unsightly sights, to look at beautiful objects, and to maintain a calm and positive mental state. Imagine a pregnant woman surrounded by beautiful tapestries and serene landscapes, all in the hopes of producing a perfect, unblemished heir. It's an almost charmingly naive, yet ultimately stressful approach to prenatal care. Historians still argue whether the medical emphasis on both male and female seed, and the need for female pleasure in conception, offered women a degree of agency in their reproductive lives, or if it simply placed an additional, often unmanageable burden upon them. While it acknowledged female biological contribution, it simultaneously held women responsible for barrenness or failed pregnancies if they did not perform correctly or experience adequate pleasure. This debate highlights the complex and often contradictory position of women within Tudor medical thought. The understanding of the female reproductive anatomy was largely inaccurate. The ovaries were not fully understood, and the process of ovulation was entirely unknown. The uterus was often depicted as an independent, wandering organ, capable of moving around the body, causing various ailments if it strayed from its proper place. This lack of precise anatomical knowledge contributed to many misguided medical interventions and explanations for reproductive problems. Childbirth itself was an incredibly dangerous event, often leading to death for both mother and child. Midwives, usually experienced local women, attended births, relying on traditional knowledge and practical experience. Physicians, who were predominantly male and trained in universities, rarely attended ordinary births, viewing them as women's work. The sheer trauma and risk of repeated pregnancies meant that for many women, the desire to space out or prevent conception was a matter of survival, not convenience. Infertility, when it occurred, was often a source of immense anxiety and could lead to marital discord, particularly if a male heir was desired. While methods to promote fertility existed, from herbal remedies and dietary advice to prayers and pilgrimages, their efficacy was, of course, entirely random. The default assumption for infertility often fell upon the woman, seen as barren or cold, although the concept of male coldness, or inadequate seed, was also sometimes considered. The psychological toll of being infertile in a society that valued progeny above almost all else must have been immense. The influence of astrology also permeated medical beliefs, including those related to reproduction. The alignment of planets or the phase of the moon might be consulted for the most auspicious time for conception, or for determining the sex of a child. This blend of celestial mechanics and human biology reflects a holistic worldview, where the microcosm of the human body was believed to be intimately connected to the macrocosm of the cosmos. The sex of a child was often attributed to the strength of the parent's seed, or the side of the womb in which the fetus was conceived. A stronger male seed, or conception in the right side of the womb, was believed to produce a boy, while a weaker seed, or the left side of the womb, would result in a girl. These beliefs, while unscientific, offered a framework for understanding and even attempting to influence desired outcomes, however futilely. In conclusion, Tudor medical beliefs on reproduction were a fascinating, if often flawed, tapestry woven from ancient wisdom, folk practices, and nascent scientific inquiry. Without the benefit of modern understanding, conception and childbirth remained deeply mysterious, dangerous, and subject to a myriad of external influences, from the spiritual to the celestial. These beliefs profoundly shaped sexual practices, fertility management, and the anxieties surrounding procreation, highlighting a world where every birth was a gamble, and the secrets of life itself remained tantalizingly out of reach. It was a time when the human body was both a miracle and an enigma, and the processes of creating life, both wondrous and terrifyingly unpredictable. Sexual violence in Tudor England, though condemned by both church and state, was a grim reality, woven into the fabric of a society with rigid power structures and often brutal legal customs. While explicit discussions of rape and sexual assault are scarce in historical records due to the prevailing social shame and patriarchal biases, their occurrence is undeniable. The legal frameworks for addressing such crimes were often complex and imperfect, reflecting an era where issues of consent, female agency, and due process were understood very differently from today. The primary legal category for what we would now term rape was forcible abduction and rape, particularly if it involved an heiress. The concern here was often less about the violation of the woman's body and more about the unlawful seizure of property or the disruption of planned marriages and inheritances. If a man abducted and raped an heiress, the crime was deemed extremely serious, often punishable by death, because it threatened the social and economic order by interfering with the transfer of wealth and status through marriage. This mainstream historical fact highlights a disturbing emphasis on property rights over personal autonomy. For women of lower social standing, or those who were not heiresses, the legal recourse for rape was far more difficult to pursue, and the penalties for the perpetrator often less severe. Proving rape was notoriously challenging. The burden of proof lay heavily on the victim, who had to demonstrate not only that force was used, but often also that she had resisted to the utmost of her ability and raised the hue and cry immediately after the assault. A woman's reputation, her social standing, and her prior sexual history could all be scrutinized and used to undermine her testimony. If she was perceived as unchaste or of loose morals, her accusation might be dismissed or disbelieved, effectively re-victimizing her within the legal system. The concept of consent as a clear and affirmative agreement to sexual activity was largely absent in the Tudor legal and social vocabulary. While violence was condemned, the nuance of coercion, intimidation, or a lack of explicit agreement was often overlooked or downplayed. A woman's silence or her failure to resist physically to the point of injury could be interpreted as tacit consent, particularly in situations where there was an existing power imbalance, such as between a master and servant. This legal blind spot created significant vulnerability for women, particularly those in subordinate positions. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to sexual violence concerns the rare instances where victims of sexual assault might attempt to use accusations of witchcraft or magical coercion as an explanation for their predicament, or to seek redress through alternative means. In a world steeped in superstition, if a woman felt she'd been bewitched into a compromising situation, or if an attacker was believed to have used a love potion, she might appeal to these supernatural explanations, rather than, or in addition to, the formal legal system. While these appeals were rarely successful in a legal sense, they reveal a desperate search for understanding and justice within the prevailing cultural framework, however bizarre. It's a sad reflection of the limited avenues available for genuine redress. Historians still argue whether the legal system's focus on property and legitimacy, rather than the intrinsic wrongness of sexual violation, meant that true justice for victims of sexual violence was almost impossible to achieve in Tudor England. While the laws existed, their application, particularly for women without social power, often fell short, highlighting the deep-seated patriarchal biases that privilege male authority and dynastic concerns over female bodily integrity. This debate underscores the ongoing challenge of assessing historical justice through a modern ethical lens. The penalties for rape, when successfully prosecuted, could range from imprisonment and fines to, in more severe cases, death by hanging, particularly if the victim was an heiress, or if the crime was deemed particularly heinous. However, the rarity of successful convictions, especially for non-noble victims, suggests that such punishments were more theoretical than common. The legal system, while possessing the power to punish, often lacked the will or the means to protect vulnerable individuals. Sexual violence could also occur within the confines of marriage. Marital rape was not a concept recognised by Tudor law. Once a woman married, her body was, in many respects, considered the property of her husband, and he had a legal right to conjugal relations. This meant that a husband could not be prosecuted for sexually assaulting his wife, effectively rendering wives legally vulnerable to sexual coercion within their own homes. This grim reality highlights the extreme power imbalance inherent in Tudor marriage and the lack of bodily autonomy afforded to women. The shame associated with sexual assault often led victims to remain silent. To speak out risked further public humiliation, accusations of complicity, or being ostracised by their community. The social stigma attached to a woman who had been raped, even if she was the innocent party, could be immense, potentially ruining her chances of marriage or leading to a life of marginalisation. This powerful social deterrent often meant that countless acts of sexual violence went unreported and unpunished, fading into the silent suffering of the victims. The vulnerability of female servants and apprentices was particularly pronounced. Living in the households of their employers, they were often isolated from their families and dependent on their masters for their livelihood. This created an extreme power imbalance that could be exploited, leading to sexual harassment, coercion, or assault. The lack of independent recourse meant that their experiences of violence were often silenced, leaving them with little hope of justice. Even within the court, where scandalous affairs were often whispered about, direct accusations of sexual violence against powerful men were rare and incredibly dangerous to pursue. The king's will, as seen in cases like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, could redefine violence to include perceived threats to the realm rather than physical assault. The power dynamics at play meant that justice for the vulnerable was a distant concept, often sacrificed at the altar of political expediency. In essence, sexual violence in Tudor England was a dark and often unacknowledged aspect of societal life. The legal system, though theoretically capable of punishment, was often hampered by patriarchal biases, a lack of understanding of consent, and the immense social pressures that silence victims. The overwhelming focus on property and lineage, rather than on the dignity and safety of individuals, meant that for many, particularly women, justice remained elusive, leaving a chilling legacy of vulnerability and unaddressed suffering. It stands as a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained gender inequality and power dynamics shaped the most horrific personal experiences in the Tudor era. In Tudor England, morality was not merely a private affair. It was a public spectacle, constantly reinforced through various cultural and legal mechanisms designed to police behaviour, particularly sexual conduct. Public displays, ranging from punitive measures to the didactic narratives of morality plays, served as powerful cautionary tales, shaping communal norms and instilling a pervasive fear of transgression. These were not just isolated events, but integral components of a society deeply invested in maintaining order and perceived virtue. Public executions, though primarily for severe crimes like treason, murder or felony, often carried a strong moralising undertone. The spectacle of the gallows, or even the gruesome drawing and quartering, was intended not only to punish the condemned, but also to serve as a stark warning to the assembled crowds. While not directly for sexual offences in most cases, unless linked to treason, as with Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, the underlying message of divine retribution for breaking societal and divine laws was clear. The public punishment of bodies was a powerful way to assert state and religious authority over all aspects of human conduct, including those of the flesh. Imagine the stench, the cries, the palpable fear in the air, all designed to ensure conformity. More directly related to sexual transgressions were various forms of public shaming and penance. The stocks and the pillory were common instruments of humiliation, where offenders, including those guilty of fornication, adultery, or petty sexual offences, would be exposed to public ridicule, often pelted with rotten vegetables or mud. This physical exposure to the community's scorn was designed to strip individuals of their dignity and reinforce social boundaries. The knowledge that one's misdeeds could lead to such a public spectacle acted as a powerful deterrent, forcing individuals to consider the social cost of their actions. A particularly common form of public penance for sexual offences, as we've touched upon, was the requirement to stand in church, often dressed in a white sheet during a Sunday service. This mainstream historical fact was a spiritual and social punishment, forcing the sinner to publicly confess and repent before their entire community, a deeply mortifying experience. The white sheet symbolised a supposed cleansing, but also served as an inescapable marker of shame. This ritual underscored the Church's pervasive authority over moral conduct and its role in policing private lives for public virtue. One can almost feel the burning blush of humiliation, the weight of 1,000 judging eyes, as the poor soul stood exposed before their neighbours. Morality plays, a popular form of dramatic entertainment, served as didactic tools, reinforcing Christian virtues and warning against sin. These allegorical dramas featured personified vices and virtues, with characters like lust, gluttony, or pride tempting a central character, mankind, away from the path of righteousness. The plays often depicted the grim consequences of succumbing to carnal desires, leading to disease, damnation, or social ruin. They were visual sermons designed to entertain while simultaneously instilling moral lessons in a largely illiterate population. The clear, often exaggerated portrayal of the wages of sin ensured that even the simplest audience member understood the dangers of illicit sexual behaviour. It's a bit like a medieval public service announcement, only with more dramatic monologues and a slightly more literal interpretation of hellfire. A quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the use of scolds' bridles, or branks, as a form of public shaming, sometimes for women accused of excessive gossiping, nagging, or sexual indiscretion. This horrific device was an iron muzzle or cage fitted over the head, with a metal plate or spike that pressed down on the tongue, preventing the wearer from speaking. The woman would then be paraded through the streets, often led by a rope, as a public spectacle of her unruly nature. While not exclusively for sexual offences, it was certainly employed against women whose conduct, including their sexual conduct or rumours about it, was deemed disorderly or disruptive to patriarchal norms. It's a chilling reminder of the brutal methods used to silence and control women who deviated from expected behaviour. Historians still argue whether the elaborate public displays of punishment and moral instruction were truly effective in curbing sexual deviancy, or if they simply reinforced existing power structures and created a culture of fear that drove transgressions further underground. While undoubtedly intended to deter, human nature, as always, proved stubbornly resilient, and illicit behaviours continued despite the harsh public consequences. The debate highlights the tension between ideal societal control and the messy realities of individual desires. Beyond formal punishments, public opinion itself was a powerful force. Gossip and rumour, unchecked by modern media, could spread like wildfire through a community, irrevocably damaging reputations. A woman suspected of fornication, or a man of keeping a mistress too openly, might find themselves socially ostracised, their standing diminished, and their opportunities curtailed. This informal policing of morality, driven by the collective judgment of neighbours and peers, was often as potent as any legal decree. The Reformation, paradoxically, initially brought an increase in the severity of moral policing, especially regarding sexual offences. With the dissolution of the monasteries and the shift from Catholic confessionals, Protestant reformers placed a greater emphasis on public demonstration of piety and strict adherence to moral codes. Parish authorities, under the new Anglican Church, were often zealous in their efforts to root out and punish sexual misconduct, seeing it as a blight on the community and an affront to God. This meant that instances of fornication, adultery, and even premarital pregnancy were rigorously investigated and publicly addressed. The purpose of these public displays was multifaceted. They served as deterrents, educational tools, and rituals of communal purification. By publicly shaming offenders, society symbolically purged itself of moral contaminants, reinforcing its collective values and reaffirming the boundaries of acceptable behaviour. It was a communal performance of morality, a constant reiteration of what was right and what was wrong, particularly in matters of the flesh. Even in literature and popular ballads, the consequences of illicit sexual acts were often depicted with stark clarity. Tragic tales of abandoned lovers, children born out of wedlock, or the spread of venereal disease served as popular entertainment, while simultaneously reinforcing the moral lessons of the era. These narratives permeated the cultural consciousness, shaping the collective understanding of appropriate sexual conduct. In conclusion, public display and morality plays were integral to the Tudor era's attempt to control and define sexual practices. Through the terrifying spectacle of punishment and the didactic narratives of the stage, society constantly hammered home the message of conformity, chastity, and fidelity. While these methods may not have eradicated all forms of sexual transgression, they certainly cast a long oppressive shadow over the intimate lives of Tudors, reminding them that their personal choices were, in many ways, a matter of public scrutiny and potential public shame. It was a world where every act, even those behind closed doors, could potentially be brought into the harsh glare of communal judgment. In a world before scientific understanding of reproduction, the anxieties surrounding fertility and successful childbirth in Tudor England often found expression in a rich tapestry of superstitions, folk beliefs, and ancient rituals. These practices, passed down through generations, represented a desperate human attempt to influence the unpredictable forces of nature and divine will, to ensure the continuation of family lines, and to safeguard the perilous journey of pregnancy and birth. Far from being mere quaint customs, these rituals were deeply ingrained in daily life, offering a sense of control and hope in the face of profound uncertainty. One of the most widespread superstitions centered on the belief that various charms and amulets could either promote fertility or, conversely, prevent conception. For those desiring children, women might carry specific objects believed to possess procreative power, such as certain stones, dried herbs known for their life-giving properties, or even animal parts, though less common for fertility than for love magic, as we've explored. Some might wear rings made from particular metals or wood, or place fertility symbols within their homes. The hope was that these physical objects, imbued with sympathetic magic, could somehow influence the natural processes of the body. Conversely, for those wishing to avoid conception, often out of economic necessity or simply to space out pregnancies, rituals might be performed to induce barrenness. We've already touched upon the dangerous use of abortifacient herbs, but milder, more superstitious methods existed too. A woman might perform a ritual under a specific moon phase, or wear an amulet believed to ward off pregnancy. This mainstream historical fact highlights the constant tension between the desire for offspring and the practical realities of managing family size in an era without reliable contraception. It's a delicate dance between desperation and magical thinking, all in the hopes of swaying fate. The timing of intercourse was also often influenced by astrological beliefs and folk wisdom. Certain days of the week or specific planetary alignments might be considered more auspicious for conception. Conversely, others were believed to be unfavourable, potentially leading to barrenness or the birth of an undesirable child. This pervasive influence of astrology meant that even the most intimate act could be governed by the perceived dictates of the cosmos, adding a layer of celestial calculation to the pursuit of progeny. Imagine consulting a dusty almanac before retiring to bed, hoping the stars were aligned for baby-making. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the use of birth girdles, or holy belts during labour. These were strips of fabric or parchment, often inscribed with prayers, biblical verses, especially from Psalm 116 or the long form of the Magnificat, or even magical symbols. They would be worn by the pregnant woman around her belly during labour, believed to protect her and the child from harm, ease pain, and ensure a safe delivery. Some even contained relics or fragments of saints' clothing, combining religious devotion with magical protection. These girdles were sometimes even blessed by the church, highlighting the uneasy coexistence of official religion and folk superstition. It's a remarkable fusion of piety and pragmatism, a physical manifestation of a desperate plea for divine and magical assistance in the face of life-threatening vulnerability. Historians still argue whether the widespread reliance on fertility rituals and superstitions stemmed from a genuine belief in their efficacy, or served primarily as psychological coping mechanisms for people facing profound uncertainties about reproduction and childbirth. While many undoubtedly believed in their power, these rituals also provided a sense of agency and comfort in a world where little medical control existed, offering solace and hope when scientific understanding failed. The debate highlights the complex interplay between faith, fear, and human resilience. The gender of a child was another common focus of fertility rituals. Sons were highly desired, particularly for landowning families, to ensure the continuation of the family name and inheritance. Various folk remedies and rituals were believed to influence the sex of the child, such as consuming specific foods, positioning during intercourse, often thought to be more likely to produce a boy if the man was on the right side, or performing rituals on certain days. These practices, while entirely unscientific, reflected the profound societal pressure to produce male heirs and the lengths to which parents would go to try and influence this outcome. Beyond conception, rituals also surrounded pregnancy and childbirth itself. Pregnant women might carry specific charms to ward off miscarriage, or avoid certain activities believed to harm the fetus. The moment of childbirth was surrounded by intense rituals and prayers, reflecting the high mortality rates for both mother and child. Midwives, who were the primary birth attendants, often incorporated these folk practices into their care, alongside their practical knowledge, blurring the lines between medicine and magic. The practice of churching was a significant postnatal ritual. After childbirth, a woman was considered unclean and could not return to church until a purification ceremony was performed. This mainstream historical fact, though rooted in Old Testament traditions, also served as a public acknowledgement of her successful, albeit dangerous journey through childbirth and her return to communal life. It was a moment of public thanksgiving and reintegration, reaffirming her role as a mother and her place within the community. The fear of changelings, fairy children swapped for human babies, was a particularly chilling superstition that could relate to fertility. If a child was born sickly, deformed, or simply didn't thrive, it might be whispered that it was a changeling, a fairy substitute for the healthy human baby. This belief offered a supernatural explanation for infant mortality or developmental delays, relieving parents of perceived blame, but also leading to often cruel treatment of children believed to be changelings. In essence, the landscape of fertility and childbirth in Tudor England was one perpetually infused with magic and ritual. From the quiet prayers whispered over a charm to the communal celebrations of a successful birth, people actively engaged with a world where the seen and unseen were inextricably linked. These superstitions and rituals were not signs of ignorance, but rather ingenious attempts to exert control and find comfort in the face of life's most profound mysteries, particularly those concerning the creation and continuation of human life. They paint a vivid picture of a society deeply connected to its ancient roots, seeking solace and strength in every available belief, particularly when it came to the precarious and utterly vital act of bringing new life into the world. The tapestry of Tudor sexual practices, woven from threads of religious dogma, legal strictures, folk beliefs, and human desire, casts a long and complex shadow over subsequent eras, influencing societal norms, moral codes, and even the very language we use to discuss intimacy. The legacy of this tumultuous period is one of profound contradictions. Extreme public condemnation of deviance juxtaposed with often discreet private indulgence. An obsessive pursuit of legitimate heirs coexisting with the harsh realities of limited reproductive control, and a rigid adherence to biblical injunctions alongside a thriving undercurrent of superstition and magic. One of the most enduring legacies is the indelible mark left on the concept of marriage itself. The seismic upheaval of Henry VIII's marital woes, leading to the English Reformation, fundamentally altered the legal and religious framework of marriage, transforming it from a sacrament solely administered by Rome to a civil institution increasingly regulated by the state. While the Anglican Church maintained the ideal of indissolubility, the possibility of annulment, however difficult, created a precedent for state intervention in private marital affairs. This mainstream historical fact laid some of the groundwork for later developments, however slow, towards secular divorce. The very idea that a monarch's personal marital needs could reshape an entire nation's religious identity echoes through history, reminding us of the immense power dynamics at play. The intense focus on legitimate male succession, born of the Wars of the Roses and perpetuated by Henry VIII's desperate quest for a son, deeply embedded patriarchal assumptions about inheritance and lineage into the national consciousness. For centuries after the Tudors, the male line would remain paramount, shaping property laws, aristocratic titles, and societal expectations. The ghost of Henry VIII's anxiety about an heir, one might argue, continued to haunt the concept of family and inheritance long after his reign, ensuring that the pressure on wives to produce sons remained a quiet, yet persistent burden. The era's severe condemnation of non-procreative sexual acts and same-sex relations left a chilling legacy of intolerance. The Buggery Act of 1533, making male homosexual acts a capital crime, remained on the statute books, largely unchanged for centuries, becoming a powerful instrument of repression, even as societal attitudes slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to shift in later periods. The legal foundation for prosecuting such acts remained firmly in place, ensuring that same-sex desire largely remained a clandestine, dangerous aspect of human experience for generations. The very language surrounding these acts, sodomy, unnatural vice, perpetuated the stigma, demonstrating how profoundly Tudor moral and legal frameworks could shape the lives of individuals across centuries. A quirky or fringe tidbit of the Tudor legacy lies in the lasting appeal of certain folk remedies and superstitions related to fertility and love, long after the Tudor period. While medical science advanced, some of these practices, particularly those involving herbal concoctions or minor charms, persisted in rural communities well into the 18th and 19th centuries, adapting and evolving with the times. The belief that one could influence love or fertility through non-scientific means proved remarkably resilient, a testament to the enduring human desire for control over unpredictable forces. It's almost as if, tucked away in quiet corners, people continued to consult their grandmother's dusty books of spells, long after kings had ceased to worry about papal dispensations. Historians still argue whether the extreme emphasis on public shaming and punishment for sexual transgressions in the Tudor era truly achieved its stated aim of moral purification, or simply drove behaviours further underground, fostering a culture of hypocrisy and concealment. While the spectacle of the stocks, or the white sheet in church, was undeniably designed to deter, human desire and ingenuity often found ways to circumvent public scrutiny, leading to a vibrant, if hidden, world of illicit sexual encounters. The debate highlights the enduring tension between rigid social control and the complex, often unpredictable realities of human sexuality. The Great Pox, or syphilis, left an enduring scar on the collective psyche, forever associating illicit sexual activity with disfigurement, agony, and death. Even as medical understanding slowly improved, the moral stigma attached to venereal disease persisted for centuries, influencing public health campaigns and private anxieties. The fear of the pox became a powerful deterrent, a grim reminder of the tangible consequences of stepping outside prescribed sexual boundaries, a legacy that perhaps only began to truly diminish with the advent of modern antibiotics. The double standards regarding male and female sexuality, so starkly evident in the Tudor era, also cast a long shadow. While women were rigorously policed for chastity and fidelity, men, particularly those of status, often enjoyed greater sexual latitude. This gendered imbalance in moral judgment persisted for centuries, shaping societal expectations for male wildness versus female purity. The idea that a man's indiscretions were less damning than a woman's, especially if they didn't threaten legitimate lineage, was a concept that took a remarkably long time to dismantle. The very concept of female bodily autonomy, severely limited in Tudor times, would only gradually begin to emerge in subsequent centuries. The notion that a woman's body was, to a large extent, her husband's property, and that her reproductive capacity was primarily for the benefit of the family line, would slowly erode, but the roots of this patriarchal control can be firmly traced back to this period. The struggle for women to gain control over their own bodies and reproductive choices has been a long and arduous journey, with the Tudor era serving as a stark reminder of the starting point. Even in literature and popular culture, the themes of forbidden love, illegitimate children, and the consequences of adultery that permeated Tudor plays and ballads continued to resonate. These narratives, rooted in the moral anxieties and social realities of the era, provided a rich source material for later playwrights, novelists, and poets, ensuring that the stories of Tudor sexual morality, in all their dramatic and tragic forms, continued to be told and reinterpreted. The Tudor era's fixation on lineage and bloodlines, driven by political instability and dynastic ambition, created a society that was both intensely personal in its anxieties about succession and brutally public in its enforcement of sexual norms. The legacies of these horrific sexual practices, not just the acts themselves but the systems of control and judgment surrounding them, are not confined to the history books. They are embedded in the evolution of our legal systems, our societal expectations, and even our psychological landscape. We still grapple with questions of sexual freedom, reproductive rights, and gender equality. Questions that, in many ways, find their genesis in the tumultuous, contradictory, and utterly captivating sexual world of the Tudors. Slowly as the centuries drift by, the sharp edges of Tudor life begin to soften. The anxieties about heirs and heresies gently recede into the vast ocean of time. The whispers of courtly intrigue grow faint, replaced by the rustle of leaves in a quiet garden. The clang of the executioner's axe fades into a distant memory, and the harsh glare of public penance dims to the gentle glow of a bedside lamp. The historical figures we've encountered, so vibrant and desperate in their struggles, now rest peacefully, their battles fought, their fates sealed. There's a quiet calm that descends, a sense of perspective that only time can bring. We leave behind the tumultuous passions and rigid dictates of a bygone age, understanding that even the most fraught periods eventually yield to the comforting embrace of night,